Panting, he runs along the docks, cursing in his mind at the informant, thinking that they didn't agree on this. He is dressed like a Yakuza in a purple shirt with a dark purple tiger print, white trousers and a gold chain. His blonde hair is pulled back and his face shows scars. Cargo containers can be seen around it. He notes that he was supposed to be alone and remembers how confused he is standing in front of a crowd of men in formal suits with menacing smiles on their faces. One of the men grinned ominously. Blood spatter. The Yakuza remembers that 4 children were killed and how the men, dressed in suits and colorful shirts, one by one fall to the ground, bleeding. He's sweating nervously, his mouth hanging open in horror. The Yakuza falls to the ground face down and notices the blood on his white trousers as he gets to his feet. His heart-rending cry echoes through the night docks. A man in a suit and expensive shoes approaches the Yakuza and asks if he has burst into tears. There are tears in the Yakuza's eyes. A man in a black suit with a dark skin color and a gun in his hand asks if the Yakuza should not be harsh and tough. Then he grabs him by the hair and slams him face first into the ground. Blood splattered on the asphalt, and he cleared his throat. The man lifts the Yakuza by the hair and asks with a smile if he is ready to die. Blood flows from the Yakuza's broken forehead, and the man concludes that the Yakuza no longer have a place in Japan. He says they came here ready to fight, and all they met were spineless monkeys who couldn't even kill. He called them scum and slammed the Yakuza's face into the ground once more with a grin. He lies shivering on the ground with his face in the asphalt. Before leaving, the dark-skinned man gave the other men the command to tie a stone to the Yakuza, but not to kill it yet, but to use it as bait because the others would come for it, to which they answered in the affirmative. Raising his head from the ground, the Yakuza thinks that he doesn't have much time left and he can't betray his comrades. Then he is surprised to notice something. He sees a guy with a grim expression and dark hair partially covering his face. The Yakuza thinks that he was here. A dark-skinned man with a smile and a cigarette in his hand turns around and asks, "Familiar face." He added that he thought it was one of his comrades, so they grabbed him just in case. A guy with dark hair and a black and green sweatshirt is on his knees with his hands folded behind his back. The man in the black hat got angry and grabbed the guy by the hair, asking why he was sitting down, and told him to get up, pulling him up by the hair. The boy's blue eyes were calm. He got to his feet, and there was a brief silence on the docks. The dark-skinned man concluded that the guy is an ordinary thief and even a little sorry for him. He stands with a cigarette raised to his mouth, the moon shining over him. He walked up to the guy with a cigarette in his mouth and looked at him with a wild smile, eyes wide, telling him to kill him because they didn't need witnesses. The boy looked back at him calmly. The man in the hat was still holding him by the hair, and the boy's hands were still folded behind his back. The boy looked down. Something caught the dark-skinned man's attention, and as he looked the guy up and down, he noticed that at first glance he was just an ordinary street urchin and concluded that he had nothing to eat, so he broke into their warehouse. The man said that if he was flooded with building materials, no one would say anything, because this is a common thing for this city. Then he noticed that the guy's shoes were missing their laces. At first, he thought that this was not unusual for a street urchin, but he noticed something, began to sweat nervously, and shouted to kill him now. The guy disappeared from the hatted man's hand and ended up behind him. He raised his fist to strike, and the man in the hat on the block covered his face with his hands, but the guy hit him on the foot. There was a crunch, and the man in the hat shook. The dark-skinned man pulled out a gun. With quick movements, the guy jumped behind the man in the hat and climbed on top of him, wrapping his arm around his neck. The dark-skinned man noticed that the guy was moving very fast, gritting his teeth. The guy reached inside the jacket of the man in the hat. A gunshot rang out, and the man behind the dark-skinned man fell, blood gushing from his chest. The dark-skinned man turned around. The guy continued to fire the gun, not getting off the back of the man in the hat. The men in suits fell to the ground one by one, hit by a single shot each. The dark-skinned man raised the gun at the guy and shot several times, cursing. The man in the hat fell to the ground, hit by 4 bullets. The boy was no longer there. The dark-skinned man was looking in the direction of the man in the hat who was falling to the ground, wondering if he was hit. The guy jumped with a gun in 2 hands behind the dark-skinned man, to the latter's surprise. Holding the gun in one hand, they aimed at each other. The boy's face was calm as the dark-skinned man opened his mouth nervously. A shot rang out. The purple-shirted Yakuza stared at the guy from the ground behind in amazement, noting that he had taken out the mafia single-handedly. The guy holds the gun with both hands, pulls the trigger, but the guy gives a yell, meaning that the bullets are out. He threw the gun at the dark-skinned man, who batted it away with his hand. The discarded pistol spun and fell to the ground. He raised the gun again, but the boy was no longer there. The guy appeared to the left behind the dark-skinned man, leaning his hand on the asphalt with ominously calm eyes. The dark-skinned man turned around in shock and raised the gun again, but with quick movements, the guy was behind him again. The man started to turn around, startled by the guy's speed, but he quickly closed the distance between them and punched the man in the back of the thigh. The dark-skinned man's scream echoed through the docks. Exhausted, he fell to his knees and the guy behind him calmly straightened up. The man was horrified to see a noose-shaped rope being thrown around his neck. The rope tightened, and the man gritted his teeth. With his mouth open and his eyes bulging, he desperately tried to grab onto the rope, choking him. The guy with a calm face continued to forcefully pull on the rope, suffocating the opponent. The veins on the man's face and arms bulged as he tried unsuccessfully to grab onto the rope, and saliva was coming out of his mouth. He looked down at the boy's hands and noticed the burn marks on the rope that bound him, and noticed the Kevlar cord that was being used to strangle him. In horror, the man realized that the guy used a cord instead of shoelaces, and it was definitely not by chance that he was here, and they were originally his goal. The man coughed and kicked helplessly at the ground until the strength left them, and concluded that this guy was the killer. The guy released the cord, and the dark-skinned man's body fell to the ground. The purple-shirted Yakuza glanced nervously at the guy who was approaching him. He held out his hand to the Yakuza and asked if he could stand up without changing his face. The moonshines blew on the back of a guy looking down at the Yakuza. The Yakuza got to his feet, shaking, holding onto his bloody leg and panting heavily without the boy's help. He looked around at the bodies of mafia members lying on the asphalt and, not believing what had happened, concluded that the guy had killed them all alone. He asked the guy who he was as he left. The guy turned around and said he wouldn't say anything, but added that the old Yakuza man had asked him to come get him. He told the Yakuza that he wasn't their enemy. It's been 12 years. The school building stands under a blue sky. The van drives along a brick fence. A guy in a white t-shirt is sitting cross-legged on the seat of the van, his hands behind his head. A voice called out to him and told him to wake up. The dark-haired guy lazily opened his eyes. A light-haired, middle-aged man, the same Yakuza wearing a black shirt with white stripes, a white suit and a gold chain, tells him that it's time to work. Yawning, the guy asked who their target was today. The man in the jacket pointed ahead and said, "Over there." The guy looked back and said he couldn't see. The man replied irritably that he would kill him and told him to look ahead. The guy picked up his gray cap and jacket with a slight smile and looked where they were asking him to go. Boys and girls in school uniforms go to school. The guy noted that this is a school. The man told him that everything was correct and the contract was concluded for a year. He asked him if he was sure he could do it alone and added that he was worried. Grinning calmly and opening the candy bar package, the guy replied that he was no longer a child. The man silently looked at the guy taking a bite of the candy bar, also opening the packaging of the bar. He said he wouldn't have bothered if it was any other place, but this high school wasn't exactly safe, chewing on a candy bar and leaning on the steering wheel. He went on to say that the school was rumored to be full of juvenile delinquents. Leaning his face on his hand and looking out the window of the van, the guy replied, "Yes." Then he noticed 4 guys in school uniforms laughing and talking about something different. One of them threw an empty can of Coke on the asphalt. The boy's eyes tightened in fury. Crows peck at the garbage left on the asphalt behind the departing schoolchildren. The man said that everything has changed, but it doesn't look like there is peace in Japan, and added that there are only more juvenile delinquents, and even the police are no longer the law to them. Crumpling the paper and throwing it out the window, the man added with a grin that he thought it was only getting worse now. The guy caught the piece of paper with his hand and said with angry eyes that it was impossible to litter. The man gave him a tense look and after a short pause, apologized. The guy shouted that the garbage should be thrown into the trash can. The man noted that he is still correct and said that this is why he is worried about him, because he is not used to bending. He put his elbow on the guy's shoulder and asked him not to start a fight. The guy got out of the car with a gray cap and jacket in his hands and said that he would try. He put on a jacket and cap that said Yamada Cleaning. The girls passing by opened their mouths in admiration and walked on, discussing how handsome he was. The guy adjusted his cap, and on his jacket was written his name, Taiga Banjo. The man stared at Taiga from the car with his mouth open. The van's door bore the Yamada Cleaning logo with 2 mops and a smiling, bespectacled man with a mustache. Taiga stands in front of the school entrance. He pulls up the sleeves of his jacket. Standing in the school corridor, behind him on the stairs sits a schoolboy and smokes, in front of him on the floor 4 cigarette butts, and under his feet, dirt. Taiga turns around and silently walks towards the students on the stairs, who visibly stiffened at the sight of him. He dropped to one knee and picked up the butt of his cigarette from the ground. The schoolboy with the short-shaven head bulged with anger, and he shouted out what he was doing. One of the students in the back asks the other if Taiga is working at school because it's the first time he's seen him, but the other replies that he has no idea. A schoolboy with blonde hair also gets angry when he notices the girls who admire Taiga, saying that he is cool. He walked up to the main character and asked who he was with an evil expression. Taiga looked back calmly, and after a short pause, he said what he was going to say. He introduced himself and said that as of today, he was a janitor at their school. He added that he had come to clean up their dirty school, and the boy's face tightened in response. The crowd of schoolchildren passing by opened their mouths in surprise. Taiga lifted the cap off his head and said, "Nice to meet you." The veins on the shaven-headed schoolboy's face bulged even more in anger, and he repeated the protagonist's last words in a loud questioning voice, saying that he was mocking him. Taiga calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out a special capsule with a sharp movement, to the puzzled attention of the shaven-headed schoolboy. He put the cigarette butt he had picked up earlier in the capsule, then turned around and started to leave, telling the students standing on the stairs to keep the school clean. The shaven-headed schoolboy clenched his fist, gritted his teeth, shouted that Taiga was laughing at them, and swung his fist towards his back. Taiga thought about replying, but then thought that it might be better to hit him right away. The schoolboy's fist approaches the main character's face. Traditional Japanese gait. The sign says, "Boss." A large man wearing sunglasses and a mustache, dressed in a white suit with a black shirt and tie, grinned menacingly. The boss is sitting in a big chair with his hands clasped in a lock and his legs spread wide. He said that some people think they don't understand anything about murder and underestimate it. The boss took the face-down photo with 2 fingers and held it up to his face. He asked if there would have been such a young genius in their company then. The photo shows Taiga 12 years ago with a gloomy expression on his face. The boss noted his inhumanity, cold-bloodedness, and antisociality. Taiga's silhouette swings the knife from top to bottom. Silhouette of the main character laughing with his hand on his face. The protagonist's silhouette points the gun forward. The boss grins and says, "A bunch of fools." Raising his palm up, he declares that people born in unfavorable conditions are always rejected by society and cannot find a place in the ordinary world, so Taiga perfectly adapted to life in the dark from an early age. Taiga in a black and green jacket stands in the midst of a scattering cloud of dust with a combat knife in her hand. Blood drips from the blade of the knife. He turns around threateningly, and his eye glows blue. The boss thinks that Taiga knows how to kill like no other, and thanks to his hands, he will always be able to get food for himself. The main character makes 3 quick stabs with a knife. With a smug grin, the boss says that this guy will always have a job. Standing on the floor of his office on his knees and leaning his hands on the floor, the boss asks for forgiveness and says that he has to dismiss them. The purple-shirted Yakuza and little Taiga look at the boss in silence. To the surprise of the purple-shirted Yakuza, the boss says that society has changed and they are living in a new world where there is no more room for murder. He asked if they understood. Remembering this, Taiga looks up. He dodged the shaven-headed schoolboy's punch by bending his torso forward. The shaven-headed schoolboy looked surprised, and 2 guys behind him shouted at him to aim better. In response, he shouted at them to shut up and said that he was just lucky. He threw a straight punch, but Taiga easily dodged it, taking a step back. Shouting a battle cry, the schoolboy struck again, and the protagonist dodged easily again. The schoolboy got angry and continued to throw punches without success, shouting that he would hit, which the others looked at in surprise until he was completely exhausted. A schoolboy with a shaved head, covered in sweat, leans his hands on his knees and tries to catch his breath. A pack of cigarettes falls from the breast pocket of his jacket to the floor. Taiga picks up the pack from the floor and asks if it's trash, immediately adding that the trash belongs in the trash can. The schoolboy with the shaved head was angry again. 2 other students say that the main character is cool and ask if he is definitely a cleaner. A schoolboy with ear piercings approaches them from behind, reproachfully asking if they were afraid. The students gaped at the voice. The schoolboy with the piercings grinned and grabbed Taiga by the collar of his t-shirt. The protagonist stared into his eyes in silence, thinking that he didn't expect to be able to grab him by the collar and noting that he definitely had experience in martial arts. A schoolboy with piercings brought his face close to the main characters and told him not to be conceited just because he was able to dodge the blows of a small fry. With a wicked smile, he told him that he was new, so he would tell him the local rule. The schoolboy with the piercings told Taiga that he didn't care that he was an adult, and if he crawled on top of them, he would crush him. He added, telling him to hide under the bench and keep a low profile. Taiga indifferently asked about the fact that he wasn't going to hit him. The schoolboy asked in surprise. The main character continued by saying that he let him grab him, and asked if he would leave just like that. Anger made a vein swell on the forehead of the schoolboy with the piercing. A teacher in a white sweater and brown skirt with brown hair is walking down the hall with the class magazine in her hand. She turns around, noticing the schoolgirls discussing how a certain guy was cool and handsome, wondering if he will stay with them. They continued their discussion, talking about how cool his voice was and how it didn't look like he was older than them. Raising a finger to her lips, the teacher pondered the word older. She noticed that the new janitor was already there, looking out the window. Then she flinched at the continued discussion about how schoolgirls were worried because he was messing with Jajima and his gang. One of the schoolgirls screamed that they would definitely kick the janitor out of the school. She ran up to the teacher, calling her Ami and asking for help. The teacher calmly asked her to address her teacher properly and told them to go to class instead of chatting away for nothing. They said they'd think about it and ran down the corridor. The teacher smiled and walked on. She thought that Jajima, the schoolboy with the piercings, had gone too far because Jajima was bullying other kids and the adults couldn't do anything, and the teachers just closed their eyes, and she was scared too. She heard the students shouting that there was a fight on the stairs. The teacher thought that she should have the courage to stop this and quickly followed the students. As she tried to push through the crowd of students, she shouted for Jajima to stop immediately, but to her surprise, she found him lying on the floor with his gang, trying to catch his breath. She saw the main character adjusting his cap, not understanding what was going on here. Holding onto the visor of his cap, Taiga asked her if she was a teacher. He said that he had decided to play with her students for a while, and he apologized. He added that he didn't swing his fists or hit any of them, so everything should be fine. She closed her eyes and touched a finger to her cheek. She then told the protagonist that he was fired, much to the protagonist's confusion. The teacher exhaled and added that she was joking and would tell us more about it later. The teacher opens the door and she and the main character find themselves in a room with lockers, a stove, dishes, a sink, a table and chair, and a washing machine. She said it was a janitor's room. Taiga touched his chin with his hand and noted that his hideout was here, to which the teacher reacted nervously. The main character put his hand on the back of his head and asked for forgiveness for showing him everything here, and said that when he got a job, he was told that they would tell him everything here, so he knows absolutely nothing. The teacher waved her hand and told him not to worry because he was new. She noted that it was strange that on his first day, the school did not provide him with a guide. Then she asked him to explain how to use the equipment. Taiga thinks that if the information about the object is not provided in advance, then he needs to use someone who can provide him with all the necessary information. He concluded that she could become an insider and leak all the information to him. The main character looks at her with a gloomy face. He thinks about how the room is locked and she has nowhere to run, but she still acts nonchalant. The teacher turns on the gas stove and burns herself. Taiga notes that she has a beautiful figure and is physically developed, but she definitely doesn't have any combat skills. He notices that she is very kind to the person she met for the first time. The teacher smiles awkwardly, saying that she was a little scared. Taiga thinks about how he needs to see if she'll turn out to be an informant, which means he should build a friendly relationship with her. The main character's focused gaze becomes increasingly grim and menacing. He introduced himself and said his name was Banjo Taiga, much to the teacher's surprise. He came closer to her and explained that he wanted to introduce himself. The teacher noted that she, too, had not yet introduced herself and asked for forgiveness. She said her name was Ami Hoshino and she was the homeroom teacher of Class 2B. Taiga paused for a moment, then called her Ami. She thought about how he'd called her by her first name so quickly. With a beaming smile, the protagonist thanked her for her kindness and said that he would be grateful to her for the rest of his life. Ami looked confused and said, "You're welcome." She then awkwardly asked him to tell her what happened to Jajima and the others, noting that Taiga didn't use violence. Opening his breast pocket, he replied that he was just cleaning up the trash. Ami looked at him questioningly, and the protagonist showed her the contents of the cigarette capsule. Taiga noted that he was surprised that they smoke on the school grounds. Ami's face tightened and darkened. She bowed her head and asked for forgiveness, in response to which the main character asked why she was apologizing. She looked away and said that she didn't want to be rude, but it was best not to stand out in this school. The main character's face darkened. She added that this time he was lucky, but among high school students there are much more dangerous guys. Taiga didn't say anything in response. As she left, Ami smiled and said that she had to go and had a lesson. He watched her go with a serious face, thought about it, and realized that it looked like making friends with everyone was going to be hard. There is laughter in the noisy classroom, and a guy with red hair and a hoodie under his jacket sitting on the desk. Yusei Kakawa, Class 2B, asks Jajima about what he lost to the new janitor, adding that the whole school already knows about it. Jajima clicked his tongue in exasperation, gritted his teeth, looked away, and told him to shut up. Akakawa, laughing, told him not to get upset, calling him the strongest second year, and added that he would be called a crybaby. The man asked him if he was making fun of him. A girl with dark hair tied back in a ponytail, Shoko Heroes, Class 2B, called the boys barbarians, saying that they always fight for some title of the strongest, and added that this is why they are so unpopular. Akakawa shouted at Shoko to shut up and added that the girls wouldn't understand them. Then he turned his attention to the girls discussing the new janitor, talking about how good-looking he was and how cool he could fight. One of the girls said that he won without hitting once and asked if their boys had a chance. The girl approached a student with light brown hair who was sitting at her desk, called her Anna, and asked if she had seen the new janitor. She calmly replied that she hadn't seen him and asked if he was really that cool, to which she was told that he looked like a real idol. Anna thought about it and opened her eyes and smiled, saying that it meant that they would meet soon. The girls stared at Anna's shining flowing hair and began to admire her self-control, calling her an adult and noting that she was used to walking with handsome men. Another girl noticed that they discussed this handsome guy too often. Akikawa gritted his teeth in exasperation. The guy with the shaved head noticed that the girls talked too much. Akikawa asked what kind of handsome guy he was, saying that he was a janitor, which meant he must be some old fart. Then he shouted, looking at Jajim, asking how long he was going to let the janitor do whatever he wanted, and whether he realized that at this rate, he was going to lose all his reputation. Jajima said irritably that he understood. Then, with a worried face, he added that Taiga was really dangerous. He said he didn't think anyone would be able to beat him if it was a one-on-one battle. The guy in the white shirt behind him asked him what he was saying. Jajima turned around, but the dreadlock guy grabbed the back of his head and slammed his head against the desk. He told him not to talk nonsense, and that Midorikikai wouldn't let the janitor get too cocky any further. The face of a large dark-skinned guy with long black dreadlocks looked menacing. A schoolboy with a shaved head shouted in horror, calling him the year. The guy's name is Midorikikai Alex Goda, Class 3D. Goda stands menacingly with his hands in his pants pockets, wearing a green t-shirt under a white shirt. Behind him are several schoolboys with menacing expressions. Jajima, holding back the blood from his nose, apologized and said that the janitor was really very strong. Goda irritably asked him about the fact that he had a washcloth instead of a brain. He leaned close to Jajim's face and told him that if Jajim was really strong, he needed to hit the weak spot, and asked him if he was speaking correctly. Jajima looked scared. Goda said that beginners should know their rules, citing the example that they have no rules in fights. He smiled ominously and cracked the palm of his hand. Ami is walking down the school corridor with a class magazine in her hands. Several schoolchildren call out to her, calling her Amit. She turns around and sees three schoolboys smiling ominously. One of them was armed with an iron pipe, the other two with iron and wooden bats. Taiga reads the folder signed as object information. He closes it and puts it on his lap, saying that he has roughly figured out the rules for cleaning the school grounds. He smiled ominously and said, "Perfect." His face returned to calm and he said that he would just follow the instructions and do his job when there was a knock on the door. He opened the door and looked out, wondering what it was, and noticed the phone on the floor. When he picked it up and looked at the screen, he was shocked to find a video call, on the other side of which Ami was tied up in a dark room with a white cloth tied around her eyes, asking what was going on, where she was, and asking someone to save her. Taiga asks where she is right now. She says she doesn't know and starts talking about second years, but they cut her off. One of the guys puts his hand over her mouth. A schoolboy with blonde hair holding a phone says that the time is up and announces the game Find the Kidnapped Teacher. He tells the protagonist that if he doesn't hurry up, Ami might get hurt badly. Taiga stares at the phone screen with a grim face. The dark-haired guy is squatting on the ground, holding Ami's head, and the blonde-haired guy is sticking out his tongue. The video call ended and the phone screen went blank. Taiga paused for a moment, then glanced nervously to the side, asking how things had turned out like this. Residential apartments. Ami is sitting on the floor blindfolded, her hands tied to the window. A guy with dark hair and a guy in a hood are standing in front of her. A guy with long hair, Masuda, calls out to them rudely and asks why they are so close to her, adding that he should be the first to try her out. The boys notice him in horror and greet him, calling him senior. Masuda walks over to Ami and squats down in front of her, telling her that it's important to present yourself properly and smiling ominously. He says he's the second best third-year kid, the right-hand man of the year, and a real gentleman. Smiling ominously, he touched his mouth with his thumb. Takashi Masuda, Class 3D, self-proclaimed right-hand man of the year. Lifting Ami's face with one hand and removing the blindfold from her eyes with the other, he notes that she is beautiful and asks why he hasn't met her before. Ami looked back at him and shook with fear. Jajima ran into the room, asking Masuda to stop, telling him not to touch the hostage because she was completely defenseless. Enraged, Masuda stood in front of him, asking him what he was going to order him around, reminding him that he was the second strongest among the third-year boys. Jajima added that he doesn't care about Ami, and if he wants to, he can even punch her. There was a pop behind them, and everyone in the room turned to look at the entrance. Masuda, with an evil smile, said that he had come, grabbed Ami with his hand, and told the main character that he was just in time. He shouted that he was told that he had taught the second years a good lesson, and threatened that if he made one wrong move, Ami would be in trouble. Taiga said that they didn't understand him and he didn't care about her. Everyone opened their mouths in surprise, including Ami. He walked over to Ami, showed her the phone he found with an indifferent face, and asked if he could throw it away. Ami is perplexed about what is happening. On the back of the phone, you can see a photo of Ami with a woman with black hair and stickers in the form of butterflies. Taiga explained that he had picked it up, but he wasn't sure if he could throw it away, so he came to check with the owner. Masuda tightened his grip on Ami and asked the protagonist if he didn't understand what was going on at all. Ami screamed, The schoolboys behind him crunched their fingers as they approached Taiga. Masuda shouted at him to be obedient and prepare his muzzle. Someone said they didn't like it. Masuda shouted to his followers not to leave a single living spot on him. The students ran towards the main character, ready for a fight. Taiga turned around and dodged the blows by crouching down, causing the three students to punch each other in the face in a circle. They fell to the ground and Taiga stood in front of Masuda. Jajima and the shaven-headed schoolboy watched from the sidelines. The shaven-headed schoolboy thought that this was his chance because he was exposed from the back and rushed at him, swinging his fist. Taiga dodged, and the blow landed on Masuda's face. Masuda, blood streaming from his nose, did not move and angrily asked where he was aiming. The shaven-headed schoolboy stammered an apology. Suddenly, a Kakawa jumps on Taiga, kicking him in the leg. Taiga falls down, and a Kakawa shouts in his face in glee and swings his foot to kick him. He kicks his face, saying that it's going to feel like a soccer ball. To his surprise, he finds that it wasn't Taiga who kicked him, but Masuda. Holding back the blood from his nose with his hand, Masuda shouts at the protagonist, asking how he is doing and whether he doesn't care what happens to the hostage. Taiga lies listlessly on the floor, then stands up in one motion and says that he didn't lay a finger on them. Masuda shouted at him to stop dodging and put himself under the blows. Taiga adjusted his cap and looked away. Jajima, with a sinister smile, announced the time of reckoning and slammed his fist from below into the protagonist's face. Taiga noted the strength and speed and thought that it would be hard to dodge. Taiga was sent flying backwards by the impact. Masuda was delighted that Jajima had hit his shot and praised him. Then, with a puzzled expression, he noticed that Taiga was flying backwards towards him. Taiga fell on top of Masuda, and they fell to the floor. Enraged, Masuda asks what it was and if he deliberately flew into it. Still sitting on Masuda's legs, Taiga says he doesn't know what he's talking about because he's the one who's being beaten up. Masuda shouted at him to shut up and get off him. Taiga smiled and said that he didn't need to be a punching bag anymore, much to Masuda's surprise. The main character explained that this is because the hostage is now safe. Ami is standing behind Taiga, who has covered her with his hand. Smiling, the main character added that they only had to escape. Masuda screamed in panic. The protagonist's face became serious and he asked them to answer the question. He asked about the fact that abduction, imprisonment, violence, and attempted rape are considered crimes in this country. He added that it was all self-defense. Smiling ominously and stretching his arms, Masuda said that even though Taiga did it with the hands and feet of second-year students, their rule is that when they are hit, they must be in response. The protagonist's fist smashed into Masuda's face. He's lying on the floor, unconscious. Jajima, a Kakawa, and a shaven-headed schoolboy look on, shocked by the protagonist's strength. Taiga said that he was forbidden to fight, but it can't be helped since they have such a rule. He concluded, self-defense. Taiga is standing with her fist raised, and Ami is standing next to him, looking at him. Ami recalls that when she was in high school, this started happening to her all of a sudden. Ami's torn sports t-shirt is covered in cuts. She explains that they damaged her personal belongings, mocked her. Students in high school uniforms smile wickedly. She says she doesn't know the reason, but the consequences just hit her. Ami concludes that she was just being bullied. Ami in her high school uniform hugs her bag and cries. She thinks about how there was no one on her side and she was desperate. Ami says that no one knew what she was going through and she couldn't even talk to her parents about it. She thought that at least the teachers would be able to help her, but they just turned a blind eye. Ami stands hugging her bag, surrounded by middle school students with evil smiles, while a gray-haired teacher in a gray suit stands with his back to them. She says that school time was a torment for her and there was no hope on the horizon. No matter how much she dreamed, she couldn't imagine a future where she would be happy. She often thought about wanting to commit suicide, but one thing kept her going, her dream of becoming a teacher, and she had succeeded. Ami smiles contentedly. She dreamed of being a good teacher who is always close to her students. She thought that she should help them, and that the children should not suffer, but in reality everything is much worse than she imagined. She couldn't see everything from where she was sitting, and the teachers were also getting hurt by particularly problematic students. Ami thinks about how her hands were tied, how every day she was crushed by her own helplessness, until Taiga appeared before her eyes. After Masuda was defeated in self-defense, all the other troublemakers fled. Taiga then took Ami's hand and quickly left from there. Another teacher found Masuda unconscious. He kept his mouth shut because he didn't want anyone to know that he was defeated by the janitor, and no rumors were spread about the incident. A red sneaker crushes Masuda's head. Taiga thinks about how the third-year girls who wanted to crush him aren't doing anything yet and are keeping quiet. Goda is sitting in a chair, one leg crossed over the other, one foot resting on Masuda's face. He grinned ominously and said it looked like their new janitor was capable of something after all. Goda said they would call a temporary truce for now. Taiga said in his mind that he was going on a date with Ami. He dresses in blue jeans with a chain, a black t-shirt and a white shirt, looking at himself in the mirror. He reflects that if he dresses too brightly, he will be too conspicuous, and it is always better to look solid but not flashy. His colleague from the company, a former Yakuza with blonde hair, standing behind him with his hands folded in front of him, notes that he recently got a job and is already going on a date. Then he asks why he called him. Taiga gracefully turned around and asked how he liked his clothes. After a short pause, the man said that he had no sense of style. Taiga replies that he has collected all the information about the latest fashion trends. The man replies that he has a sense of style like a schoolboy and that he does not understand what a woman wants at all. He covers his face with his hand and exhales heavily. The man tells him with a smug smile that adult women need a strong shoulder and they only fall in love with a reliable and solid man. He lists standing in an elegant pose, hairstyle, costume, perfume, facial expression. He asks him to look at it, adding that everything should radiate solidity. Taiga replies without turning around that he heard him, which annoys the man. The main character says that he has to go, and the man asks if he is serious about going in this form. He looks after the main character in surprise and notes that he really left. With a worried look on his face, he asks if he's sure he can handle it. Crowds of people walk along the night street of the city. Taiga spots Ami, who greets him. She is wearing a blue blouse with a long white skirt and an open coat, and a white purse is slung over her shoulder. She pushes her hair behind her ear and smiles warmly at him. Ami asks if he's been waiting too long, and Taiga replies that he just got there. He notices that she's staring at something and asks what's the matter. Ami asks why he didn't put a chain around his neck. Taiga replies that hanging it around her neck is dangerous and impractical in a fight. Ami suggests that he go and asks if he drinks alcohol, to which he replies that he does. She flashed a beaming smile and was delighted, saying that she would show him around a restaurant. They clashed their beer glasses together and a toast was made. Ami waves her hands around, showing him a table full of meat with a roaster in the middle, and says that she's giving him a treat to thank him today. Flexing her hand with tongs in hand, she suggests that she roast the meat. Taiga stops her and grabs a pair of tongs as a fighting weapon, telling her that he will do the frying. Ami awkwardly notes that it sounds ambiguous, and Taiga agrees. Taiga abruptly opens her eyes wide and puts the meat on the brazier with graceful movements of the tongs. He notes that thick chunks of marbled beef can be tough and not particularly edible when fried incorrectly. But if you understand the very nature of the meat and take into account the directions of the fibers, the meat will come out soft, and she will be able to enjoy the richness of the taste of marbled beef. Ami swallowed nervously as she watched Taiga adjust the meat with the tongs. With a serious face, he serves a piece of fried meat with tongs and asks for a taste. She wonders how much he knows. He said that he had to understand meat at his last job, adding in his mind that he cut, not ate. Ami picks up the meat with her chopsticks and says, "Bon appetit." She puts a piece of meat in her mouth, her eyes glisten, and she says it's delicious. She notes that the cooking method can completely change the taste, and tears come out of her eyes, which Taiga notices. As she washed it down with beer, she noticed that it tasted even better with beer, and he suggested that she eat more if she liked it so much, putting a new piece of meat on the roaster with tongs. With a clumsy grin, Ami asked if she could have a bigger drink tonight. Taiga agreed, saying that he would walk her home later. Swaying from side to side from the alcohol, Ami asks the main character if he has a girlfriend. He says no, and she jumps up, slamming her hands down on the table, asking if it's really not, and Taiga answers in confusion that he really doesn't have one. She sat down, saying it was weird and she thought he was popular. He replies that he thinks it should be more popular among men. Ami asks him what kind of nonsense he is saying, and explains that she is surrounded only by students and old teachers. Taiga asks if she is interested in younger or older men, but she says that the age difference is too big. Ami then added with a drooping face that she was a teacher and didn't have time for love. Taiga wondered if this was the right time to ask about the school situation and told her that he would like to talk to her about school. Ami replied with a grim face that it was nothing special, just like any other school. She explained that there are those who are bullied, and there are those who are bullied, and irresponsible adults turn a blind eye to this and do nothing. She added that she didn't say it should stay that way, but there was absolutely nothing she could do, and that she was just as pathetic, her hands clasped in her lap. Then Ami exhaled and waved her hands, shouting about why things weren't going her way. Taiga replied that he was no better, and looking down, said that he had only recently started working as a janitor and didn't even know about the self-defense rule. Speaking of self-defense, Ami puffed out her cheeks and said that she shouldn't go too far either. Taiga excitedly asked if he had gone too far. Ami replied with a smile that she was still grateful that he had saved her. She said that he used little force and subdued the students without resorting to violence, and that she sincerely admired him. The main character looked at her in surprise. She added that if she was as strong as he was, she would be able to change everything, and asked how he learned all this. Taiga replied, experience from a previous job. Then he explained that in our time, many companies do not welcome violence, so it was difficult to find a new job. Ami smiled awkwardly and wondered where he had worked before. Then she remembered something, sat down next to him, and said she had a request. Ami put her hand on the protagonist's chest and asked if he could teach her how to make them obey without violence. She was looking at him with serious, burning eyes. Taiga thought that this might play into his hands, and he would be able to get information from her more effectively, and then the informant would always be at his side. He agreed, and Ami smiled happily. Taiga then added that there was a condition. Ami tensed questioningly. He told her that she should tell him everything that was going on at school. Ami asked in surprise if that was all, and Taiga said that it was very important to him. She agreed with a smile and offered to exchange contacts. They exchange contacts, and Ami looks triumphantly at her phone. Taiga's phone only shows 2 contacts, Tatsuo Yamadura and Ami Hashino. He looked at the phone screen with a serious face and said that now he has 2 contacts. Ami asked about being the second one, and assumed that the first one was someone from the family. Taiga thought about it and replied that Tatsuo, a former Yakuza with blonde hair, might fit the family's description, calling him a bro. Ami thought about what he meant by big brother, and decided that he had a difficult situation in the family. Ami thanked the main character, and he returned the favor. When they went outside, Taiga asked her to come over to him. He grabbed her wrist with one hand and her waist with the other, and she blushed in disbelief and asked what he was doing. Then he put his hand on her stomach and thought, not bad. Confused, Ami asked her to let go. Taiga released her and apologized, while Ami looked down at the floor in embarrassment. He said she had good abs and asked if she worked out a lot. Blushing and moving her hands profusely, she said that she was already at an age where it was easy to gain weight, so she was doing fitness and going to the gym. Taiga pondered and thought, so nothing out of the ordinary. Ami turned around and offered to go before they attracted too much attention, to which Taiga agreed. Suddenly, they noticed a plump middle-aged man in a business suit and a girl in glasses and a sundress walking in front of them. Ami asked, Soma. Taiga asked if it was an acquaintance of hers. She replied that it was a student from her class, and Taiga assumed that she was walking with her father. Ami thought about how she wanted to check if she was getting involved in something, and suggested that she follow them up for a bit. The main character agreed. Ami watched them, peeking out from behind the advertising sign while Taiga just stood there. He told her that there was no need to hide like this and told her to just go quietly. He asked her to pay attention to how many people there were and said that it would be better to just blend in with the crowd, and explained that the unnatural behavior was too prominent. Taiga told her not to follow directly behind them, but to walk a little diagonally, adding that if possible, it would be better to follow the sidewalk on the other side of the street. Taiga explained that they should do everything possible so that the persecuted do not find out about their intentions. He then said that their target was Ami's student and she might recognize her, in which case they would just pretend to go about their business and not notice them. Ami noticed that he knew a lot about it, and he said that he had to do it at work. In her mind's eye, she assumed he was a detective. Then she pulled herself together, saying that it was best not to be distracted, which Taiga told her not to worry about, and that he wouldn't lose sight of them. Ami noticed the way the man put his arm around Soma, putting his hand on her shoulder, and noticed that it didn't look like a father hug. The main character assumed that they were dating. Noticing that Soma was looking away uncomfortably, Ami noted that she didn't seem to be interested in the man in that regard. Even though she doesn't want to say it, Ami said that it looks like he's her daddy. Taiga asked again. She said it was a man you were dating and sleeping with just for the money. Separated from the main characters by the crowd, a man and Soma walk down the street. The man smiles, putting his hand on her shoulder. Soma is nervous. Taiga thought it was a part-time job and said that she was doing great, to which Ami retorted that there was nothing to praise her for. She noted that she is a diligent student with excellent grades. The main character asked about the situation in the family, and Ami replied that they have an ordinary average family. Taiga said that people aren't always what they seem. Suddenly, the chased pair turned a corner and Taiga and Ami hurried after them, and found themselves on a street full of pink lanterns and signs. They noticed Soma yelling at the man to stop while he was holding her wrists, and that they didn't agree on this, which the man didn't agree with. She nervously tells him that he said they were just going to have dinner. The man replied with a grin that he thought it was clear enough and urged her on, saying it would be quick. Soma shouted back at him that she wouldn't do that to someone like him. The man irritably asked what she was carrying and what she wanted, offering money. Ami rushed forward, asking the man what he was doing. They were afraid, and the man released the girl. Soma turned around and was startled to find her teacher. The man poked Soma in the shoulder with his finger and asked if it was an acquaintance of hers. Suddenly, Soma ran away. The man turned to Taiga and Ami in exasperation. Taiga covered Ami with his hand and asked the man what he was going to do. He shouted what they cared and told them to leave. Ami shouted that she was responsible for this girl. The man asked if she was a teacher and was surprised that Soma was from a high school. A crowd of aggressive people approached Taiga and Ami from behind. The red-haired girl says that Soma ran away with the client, and after addressing Ami as a teacher, asked her to take responsibility for her, smiling ominously. Ami recognized her as her student, Kusamoto. Kusamoto was surprised when she realized that her teacher was standing in front of her. Ami asked her what she was doing at this late hour. Kusamoto interrupted her in a panic, and Ami said with a serious face that she couldn't turn a blind eye to this. A voice rang out, amiably urging everyone to calm down. A smiling young man with a shaved head stepped forward and bowed apologetically, hands still in his pants pockets. He urged not to shake the air unnecessarily. Ami asked who he was, and he introduced himself as Noriyuki Sanzo. Raising his head, he explained that he works for a service that brings wealthy adult men together with young energetic girls. Still smiling, he reminded me about dating apps. He said they do the same thing. Ami retorted that Soma wasn't of legal age yet, and they were engaged in child molestation. Noriyuki, still smiling, replied that it wasn't their fault, but the middle-aged man's fault. He opened one eye slightly and looked at him with a cold-blooded gaze, and the man was startled. Noriyuki put his hand on his shoulder, looking at him with dead eyes, but still smiling, and said that he tried to take an underage girl to the hotel by force and called him a bad customer. The man protested that they had not told him anything about it, and he thought that she was no longer a child. Walking slowly towards the man, Noriyuki warned that he was like a Buddha, so he only forgives 3 times. With a sinister smile, he told him to work his head off and remember that he had told him that she was still in high school. The man shouted that he hadn't spoken. Noriyuki asked if he might not have heard correctly. He replied that he didn't exactly say so. Noriyuki asked if he was sure. The man started to say that the man hadn't told him about it, but he interrupted him with a punch to the face, which sent the man flying to the side and hit the wall. The veins on Noriyuki's face bulged with anger and he screamed, cursing at him for warning him. Noriyuki's face returned to its former good-natured smile and he once again begged Ami's forgiveness, and he started to walk away, dragging the man on the ground, holding him by the collar of his jacket. He said that he would take this unlucky client to the police. Ami wanted to stop him, but Teiga told her that they had to leave because no matter how suspicious it was, they didn't have any proof. As she left, Ami glanced at Kusamoto, who looked away nervously. The next day, there was laughter in Class 2B. Anna asked what Hoshino and the janitor had left behind. Kusamoto, laughing, suggested that they were looking for a love hotel. The schoolgirls participating in this conversation laughed. Anna replied that she didn't think Ami was that kind of person. Kusamoto suddenly remembered and said that she watched yesterday's broadcast on PayTube and that she liked it, and she also wants to try this makeup, in response to which one of the schoolgirls said that she would look like an ugly girl. Anna smiled and said that different cosmetics are suitable for different people and that it is better to use what is right for her. The schoolgirls said that Anna is a beauty with any makeup and complained that there is no justice in this world. Speaking of uglies, Kusamoto recalled and looked at Soma with disdain. She sat with her head bowed down and twitched when she felt her gaze. Kusamoto leaned over Soma's desk and clarified that Ami had called Soma in after school. She approached her face and with a threatening look told her not to dare say anything to her. Soma continued to sit in silence, her head bowed down in fear. Kusamoto clicked her tongue in exasperation and called out to her as she left that she hoped she heard her, adding that she was annoyed by her. A blonde-haired guy wearing a blindfold was looking at this scene with a serious face. The school bell rang for recess. Teiga walks down the hallway with a sign warning about wet floors and a mop. He thought about the fact that there were too many people in the hallways during the big break, and decided to start cleaning up the seats away from the classrooms. As he was getting ready to leave, he heard shouts from the women's bathroom, like someone was taking money from someone. Teiga placed a cleaning warning sign in front of the entrance of the women's restroom and entered it. Several schoolgirls, including Anna and Kusamoto, surrounded Soma. Kusamoto pretentiously asks why there is so little, and if she could have gone to the hotel with him. Soma protested that this was not what they agreed upon, to which Kusamoto replied that the client's wish was the law. Soma said it was wrong and looked to Anna for support. Anna looked disgusted and asked who she was looking at. Soma was startled. Anna went on to say that she and Erika were involved in this business together and that she should speak up if she had something to say. She said that she was not her assistant and she was just asked to act as an intermediary and asked not to look at her. Soma retorted that Kusamoto wouldn't let her get a word in. Anna let out an exasperated sigh and said with a grim face that she hated people like Soma, laymen who could never finish what they started. Soma was stunned with horror. The schoolgirl whispered to Kusamoto that Anna was ruthless, and Kusamoto agreed with a laugh. Kusamoto ordered Soma to listen and said that her job was to cuddle stupid but rich adults, for which she gets a lot of money, and then it was Kusamoto's turn, and she was blackmailing their rich client for groping a minor. Kusamoto's face broke into a devilish grin. She added that they were both professionals, and asked Soma to work hard to do their work like a professional. Soma pursed her lips and quietly obeyed. Still grinning, Kusumoto was satisfied with the answer. Then she said there was still something important to do and turned on the water pressure going into the hose. Kusumoto pointed the hose at Soma, who opened her mouth in horror and told her to stand still and not move. A girl's heart-rending scream rang out. Then laughter. Soma stands wet from head to toe, her fists clenched. Anna told Kusumoto that she had gone too far, but Kusumoto replied with a smile that it was necessary. Smiling slyly, she said that if Soma caught a cold and left school early, she wouldn't have to meet Ami. Taiga said that she didn't have to go anymore. Kusumoto whirled around at the voice and asked who it was. Taiga played a video recording of Kusumoto's words where she talks about their working conditions on his phone. He showed a phone showing Kusumoto hosing Soma with water and said that he had captured everything that happened and would pass on the video. The women's restroom was silent. She shouted at the main character why he even went to the women's bathroom, saying that he should be ashamed of himself and calling him a pervert. Taiga stepped forward and asked why he should be ashamed if he only came here to do his job. Taiga stands in a pretentious fighting stance, wielding a bucket and a mop. Shocked, Kusumoto said that he was crazy, and the girls decided that it was better to just leave. They ran out of the bathroom, running past Taiga, and Kusumoto said she would remember that. The protagonist adjusted his cap, and Kusumoto peeked out from behind the wall and warned that if anything came up about what had happened today, she would set the Yakuza on him. Taiga reacted to these words and thought about the fact that there were still Yakuza in their country. Meanwhile, at Yamada's cleaning office, a mustachioed man in a Hawaiian shirt exhaled cigarette smoke. This is the former boss of the Yamada clan, the current president of the Yamada cleaning company, Yamada. He asked again, Yakuza as bodyguards for the stars. Then he added that he couldn't even imagine. He asked what was in fashion now, trying to remember the right word. The man in the white suit sitting across from him assumed that he was talking about the revelations, and Yamada said that was it. He said that in their time there was no internet, and all the dark deeds were easy to hide, and now you can incite hatred and fierce debates with the slightest stuffing. He added that without the information known to the former Yakuza, there would not have been so much exposure on PayTube. The man in the white suit was listening with his hands clasped together, smiling. Yamada laughed out loud, saying that before they could even blink, Japan had become a peaceful country. The man said that Yamada's smile is a real proof that the Yakuza are now living peacefully, and said that thanks to him, he learned a lot of new things. Yamada replied with a raised index finger that they were now an officially registered company that worked honestly, and that he didn't think there were many Yakuza left in our time. The man adjusted his round glasses with a smile, said that he understood everything, and thanked Yamada for his cooperation. In the women's restroom, Soma's clothes are drying on the stall doors while Taiga is mopping the floors with a mop. Remembering Kusumoto's words, he wonders if the Yakuza is still afloat, but decides it's too early to tell, especially since it doesn't matter right now, and glances at Soma, who is sitting on the floor wrapped in the main character's jacket. She looked downcast, then turned to the main character and thanked him for the jacket. He asked her what grade she was in and said he would bring her a change of clothes. She replied that she didn't have a change of clothes with her and that she had nowhere to go either. She buried her face in her hands. Taiga told her that she could stay here until he finished cleaning, adding that no one would come in here. Blushing, she was surprised that he wasn't angry. He asked why he should be angry if he didn't know anything and didn't stop cleaning the floors. She protested that he had seen her with that man. He replied indifferently that he had no reason to be angry, and added that he didn't fully understand what meant. She stared at him in surprise, her mouth hanging open, and then laughed and said he was weird. Taiga looked at her in silence. Soma looked at the floor and said it was dirty money. He asked her if she needed them. She replied that the opportunity for easy money had beckoned to her and that she had only been paid for dates before, but she didn't think it would come to this. Soma was trembling. Taiga hit the mop handle on the floor as he stood in front of her and told her to tell her if she wanted to share her problems. She waved her hands and asked when consulting was a janitor's job. He replied that the safety of students is directly related to the cleanliness of the institution, and it is his job to maintain it. He explained that it can be said that his duties include creating an environment in which it will be easier to maintain cleanliness. Soma looked up, blushing, then swallowed and lowered her eyes. Taking a deep breath, she said that she was a member of an art club and that she wanted to go to an art college after graduation, but that she needed money for this, and it would be difficult for her family to pay for her studies, so her parents were against it, and she decided to earn money herself. Taiga responded by telling her that she was doing great. Soma looked at him in surprise. He told her that since he was born, he had always done what his parents told him to do and never decided for himself. She lowered her face, blushing, and said that she hadn't done anything to deserve praise. Taiga replied that the method she chose was disgusting, but told her not to give up the dream but to find another way to fulfill it. She opened her mouth in surprise and looked at him, then smiled and thanked him and asked what she should do now. She explained that if she quits this job, Kusumoto will call her friends from Midorikikai. Soma said she was afraid of what she might do. Taiga waved the mop in the air and said that after listening to her, he decided to take care of this business and work with Midorikikai. In the janitor's room, Taiga told Ami what had happened while sitting at a table across from each other. He offered her some tea, and she asked for a warm one. She apologized, saying that she should have listened to her. He reassured her that it was even better because he didn't think she would have told her everything. Ami agreed and asked if Soma had decided to leave. Taiga replied that she said she would find a decent part-time job. Exhaling, Ami smiled and said she was glad. Taiga said that something needs to be done about Kusumoto's business right now, and that if we sit back, there might be other victims. Ami put her hand on her forehead and agreed. He asked her if she had spoken to Kusumoto, adding that Kusumoto wanted to call her after school. Ami replied in frustration that she didn't show up. She suggested that maybe I should call her tomorrow and tell her straight out. Taiga replied that he didn't think it would make any difference, and Ami agreed. He then said that if they dealt with Kusumoto, Midorikikai would put another student in her place. He explained that such organizations are like insects or spiders, because if one of their legs is torn off, they will still be able to move. The main character's face darkened and he said that according to his theory, to end them, you need to hit the body. Ami replied that it was a strange comparison. Taiga wondered aloud how they could get to the very center of the organization. Ami remembered something and said that the guy said they were some kind of dating apps. Taiga picked up on her idea and said that they would look for them on third-party sites or dating apps. On the phone screen in the hands of the main character is written, online dating. On the phone screen in Tatsuo's hand, online dating is also open. The voice thanked him for waiting. A pretty girl with dark brown hair pulled back in two ponytails jumped out behind him and told him that he was cool and her type. Tatsuo replied that he was glad to hear it and that today he would show her how real adult dating works. The girl said it sounded like fun. Looking at the girl wearing a pink sweatshirt and a white skirt, smiling innocently, he thought that she was naive and didn't understand anything. Tatsuo smiled wickedly and thought that modern children were stupid. Tatsuo takes a shower. A full-length dragon tattoo can be seen on his back. A girl wearing a white lab coat looks at a mug of hot drink. Tatsuo, also wearing a white lab coat, wipes his head with a towel and asks her if the hotel is stylish. She smiled, agreed, and said it was her first time in such a place. He approached her with the menu open and asked if she had looked at the menu, noting the swanky local cuisine and complimenting the service. She laughed and admired how much he knew. She looked into the envelope with the money and asked if he was sure that he wanted to give her such a sum of money just like that. After changing her clothes, Tatsuo told her not to worry and that she could pick them up. He explained that he had been told to spend it on whatever he wanted, so there was nothing to worry about. She was delighted and thanked him, then asked if he would ever call her again. Tatsuo asked with a grin about her lack of money and said that he would think about it. He said he had to go and put the hotel bill on the table. The girl waved her hand vigorously and said goodbye, saying that they would see each other again. Tatsuo raised his hand as he approached the door and said that it would be nice in a little while. In front of Tatsuo are several guys, including Noriyuki. Tatsuo rubbed his cheek with a finger and said that he didn't remember asking Noriyuki to meet him. Noriyuki showed him the phone and asked if it was in the photo. The photo shows the girl he was with earlier wearing a white robe over her naked body and Tatsuo without clothes. Tatsuo clutched his head and shouted that he would never have thought that he would be so divorced at his age. He knelt down with his hands on the ground and said that he was so sad that he was going to cry. Two guys pulled him to his feet and told him not to give a concert. Noriyuki smiled and invited him to take a walk somewhere. Tatsuo said that he understood everything and escaped from the guy's hands, adding that he wasn't going anywhere. They came to the door of a building with a play sound sign. Taiga stands at a distance and watches them. One of the guys hurries Tatsuo, who tells him to shut up. Taiga adjusted his cap and thought that everything was going according to plan, and that Tatsuo was very good at playing the real scumbag. He followed them into the store, and the clerk demanded that he stop. Taiga turned around and said with a threatening face that he had come to clean up. The seller asked who he was and what kind of company it was, adding that he did not remember such a cleaning service working with Midorikikai. Taiga thought about what he should do and noticed the seller's clothes, which made him angry. Leaving the salesman unconscious, Taiga dusted off his hands in satisfaction. He stripped the salesman of his clothes, leaving him lying in his underpants, remarked that his uniform fit him perfectly, and said that first he needed to determine how many enemies there were and where they were. He dropped to one knee and listened. There was singing coming from the booth numbered 201, and Taiga assumed it was just a regular customer. There was laughter from the next booth, and someone said he was next. The main character decided that here, too, an ordinary client. From the next booth, a female voice was saying that she had a boyfriend, to which another voice responded by saying what a fancy bag he had bought her. Taiga decided that this was also a regular customer even though they weren't singing there. He heard a knock and peeked around the corner. He saw Soma in the hallway, which shocked him. Soma was staring blankly at the floor, and Taiga couldn't understand why she was there. A voice behind called out to the main character, asking him to look in his direction. Taiga turned around, and there was a man with earrings in front of him. The man asked him if he had a minute. Taiga's eyes tightened when he saw the man in front of him wearing round glasses with a snake-like smile, and he knew that he was strong. Several people were sitting on the sofa opposite Tatsuo, including Noriyuki, Kusimoto, and Anna. They asked him how much he could pay. Tatsuo replied irritably that he had already said that he didn't have any money. Kusimoto asked if he was joking and understood the situation he was in. One of the schoolgirls shouted that he was just an old fool. Anna gave him a scornful look, calling him a freak. One of them told Tatsuo to stop pretending when Soma came through the door. Everyone paid attention to her. Kusimoto jumped up to her and furiously asked her why she was here, assuming that she wanted to make more money. She said she came to tell her that she wanted to leave. Kusimoto slapped Soma across the face, and her glasses flew off her face to the floor. Enraged, Kusimoto shouted at her that she was an accomplice and not to act like she was determined to become righteous. She kicked it, and one of the guys caught her by the shoulders. With a malicious smile, Kusimoto said to make sure that the thought never occurred to her again. The guy grabbed Soma's wrist, ignoring her protests, and grinned, saying that he would have to punish her. Noriyuki looked at this with a smile on his face, then turned to Tatsuo, asked for forgiveness, put his hands in a lock, and told him to ignore it, looking at him with cold eyes. Tatsuo said that even though he was forbidden to wave his fists, he couldn't ignore it, and stood up. Smiling, Noriyuki asked again. The guy yelled at Soma to calm down and twitched, trying to grab her while she struggled desperately, but they saw Tatsuo standing up and stopped. He grabbed the guy who attacked the Soma by the face with his hand and threw it to the side, breaking the table with it. Soma looked at the scene in disbelief. Tatsuo asked if she was okay and handed her the glasses. Soma replied that she was fine and thanked him. Shaking with anger, Noriyuki talked about Tatsuo not giving money and smashing up the room, but he is like a Buddha, so he forgives 3 times. He stood up from the couch, still smiling, his face bulging with veins. He told Tatsuo to pay up and get out. The man casually excused himself and tossed him a coin. He said it was enough money for a sucker like him. Noriyuki yelled in a rage that Tatsuo was laughing at him, calling him bald. A man with glasses approaches Taiga. He realizes that he is from Midorikikai and asks what he wanted. The man told him not to pretend, and that as soon as he saw him, he immediately revealed it, because such strong guys do not work at the reception in karaoke. He took out a combat knife and apologized, saying that he would have to deal with it, explaining that he had such a job. Taiga with a serious face and Tatsuo with a sinister smile thought that they hadn't had a serious fight in a long time. A bespectacled man stands in front of Taiga with a knife in his hand and realizes that a knife can't scare him. He noted that ordinary people would have already flexed their muscles reflexively, but Taiga is completely calm. The man thinks that he is used to fighting, but he is used to killing, so no matter how good he is, one accurate blow and his life will end. He twirled the knife in his hand and decided to see what it could do with a sinister smile. He lunged forward, thrusting his knife forward. Taiga pulled the knife hand away from him with a calm face. The man looked at him with a grin and raised his foot to strike, aiming for the head. Taiga calmly blocked the punch with his hand. The man stopped smiling and wondered who he was. The main character asked him if he would attack again, and announced that this meant that it was his turn now. He thought about the fact that in a fight with an opponent who has a knife, you need to aim at the joints of the hand in which he holds it. With a quick movement, he slammed his fist into the man's arm, and the man gritted his teeth. He noticed that the man had easily closed the distance between them, but he would have time to block with the back of his hand, which he did. The man concluded that this was better than potentially losing his fingers. He thought that neither dodging nor blocking would work otherwise, and concluded that he was strong after all. The man took off and ran around the corner. Taiga chased after him, thinking that he was different from the ones he had fought before. After turning the corner, the main character could not find the enemy. A knife flashed behind him, and the man leapt at Taiga with a crazy smile, raising the knife to his head. He dodged and slammed his outstretched palm into the man's face, causing him to drop the knife and fly away. Getting up from the floor, the man said that he caused a lot of problems. He said that he mistook him for a street brawler and asked the main character about his military training. Taiga stared back in silence, his face immaculately serious. The man said that no one would help him, and he would not be able to return the knife, smiled and said that there was nothing to do and that he would have to take it seriously. He smiled ominously as he put on his black combat gloves. Cursing, Noriyuki shouted at Tatsuo to show him the quality of the local service. They are standing opposite each other with bottles in their hands. They screamed and hit the bottles, which shattered, spilling their contents all over the room. Tatsuo notices that the bottles weren't empty. Another guy jumps at Tatsuo from behind, swinging an iron pipe. He notices this and dodges by stepping to the side. He grabs the boy's head and slams his face into the floor, knocking him unconscious and shaking. Enraged, Noriyuki tore open his jacket, shouting at Tatsuo for ruining his jacket. Tatsuo started to undress, yelling at him that he was actually the one who ruined his suit because the alcohol was his. Baring their muscular torsos, Noriyuki and Tatsuo glared at each other. Noriyuki picked up the iron pipe, and Tatsuo asked him if he was sure that he would be able to take it out with his thin hands, adding that he would move more slowly. Noriyuki shouted at him to shut up and lunged towards him, hitting Tatsuo in the torso with the end of the iron pipe. He coughed in pain and fell back against the wall. Tatsuo fell to the floor, trying to clear his throat and catch his breath, and Noriyuki smiled and said that it might slow down a normal person, but if you know how to use it, it's a completely different matter. Noriyuki stands in a fighting stance, armed with a long metal pipe and smiling ominously. Sitting down, Tatsuo clarified that it was Bijutsu and said that he didn't expect it. Noriyuki noticed the dragon tattoo on Tatsuo's back and noted with a smirk that he was a Yakuza. Tatsuo, standing up, corrected him that he was a former Yakuza. Noriyuki agreed, saying that it was obvious, because now they were all going back in time, and the underworld had turned its back on them, and that they were all nothing and nothing. He threw another blow with the pipe, this time at Tatsuo's face. Noriyuki laughed viciously, enjoying how lucky he was to be able to beat up a real Yakuza. As he continued to hit Tatsuo's body with the pipe, he noticed that he had been hit by some weakling, but he didn't mind. Noriyuki added that he was already tired of beating up ordinary people. Tatsuo screams in pain as he hits him on the floor with the pipe. Noriyuki rolled his eyes up in pleasure, saying that he got goosebumps whenever he imagined the sight of a Yakuza crying in pain and begging on his knees. Tatsuo addressed him as Niobata. Out of surprise, Noriyuki stopped throwing punches. Tatsuo asked him about the fact that it was normal for him to torture people, and he enjoyed it. He told him with a smile that he was playing a tough psychopath, but in fact he was a small fry. The smile faded from Noriyuki's face, and in a rage, he raised the metal pipe above him to strike, and Tatsuo put his head under the blow. The girls watched in suspense. Noriyuki said that was all, glaring down at Tatsuo angrily. He tried to remove the pipe from his head, but to his surprise he couldn't move it. Tatsuo grabbed the pipe with his hand and told him that he wouldn't believe how many times he had to go through hell, and told him to consider Tatsuo as his regular customer. He smiled ominously, and his eyes glowed blue. Noriyuki looked at it in shock, saying that it was nonsense. Tatsuo held up the phone with Noriyuki holding it and asked if he knew the name of this pose. He answered his own question that it was a home run announcement with a satisfied grin. Taiga Banjo was standing in front of a man in a white suit. They looked at each other in silence. They were suddenly interrupted by a stranger flying in through the glass door, causing the door to shatter into many shards of glass. The man who came rushing into the room immediately plopped down on the ground. He was powerfully built, with a cropped head and a scarred skull. Suddenly, another man came in after him, greeting Taiga. He was just as solidly built, and his hair was blonde and slicked back. He slung his jacket and shirt over one shoulder while the other scratched the back of his head. He asked Taiga Banjo if he was fighting someone here, too, and asked if this bespectacled guy was a friend of Lutta's. The unknown man continued to lie on the floor, sprawled out in the shape of a star, while Taiga calmly answered the man's question about how he had no idea why the guest asked how this could be. The bespectacled man squinted towards the man who had recovered a bit and was looking at them in disbelief, trembling a little. Inwardly, he thought that he recognized him, and that it was Noriyuki Sanzo from Midorikikai. A blonde man named Yamadura approached Taiga, and Taiga asked him if they were from Midorikikai and at the same time asked what happened to Yamadura's clothes while crossing his arms over his chest. The man asked a counter question and also asked Taiga what he was wearing himself. Taiga Banjo was wearing the same clothes in the form of trousers, a shirt, and a green robe tied at the waist. Initially, these clothes were necessary for him to penetrate. The bespectacled man exclaimed in surprise, why didn't he tell him right away in such a case? Suddenly, the hostility on his part disappeared. He pushed his glasses up on his face and said with a grin that in this case, it changes everything. The man lying on the floor suddenly raised his voice and asked if the man with glasses was the boss here, to which the man smiled and turned to Taiga and Yamadura and asked if he could chat with this stranger for a while. Yamadura passed by and told him to wait a bit first, and then he could do anything with him whatever he wants. He glanced over his shoulder at me and said it was his turn first, and then his turn. Pushing his glasses up on his face and smiling maliciously, he told Yamadura that he could do whatever he wanted. Yamadura waved it off and apologized. Suddenly, he swung his foot, hitting the man on the floor squarely in the jaw. A huge bloodstain appeared on his face, leaving the footprint of Yamadura's boot. Blood smeared his chest, trickling down his face. Yamadura leaned over him and, with a mad face, told him to tell him everything immediately, starting with who he was working for. His eyes were blazing with rage at that moment. The man clenched his teeth tightly and shouted loudly that he would never betray his own people. With a short I see, Yamadura's fist immediately flew straight at his face. He continued to beat him up countless times, throwing one punch after another. All he could think about was what was wrong with him. Yamadura paused for a second, fist ready, and asked him if he had changed his mind again. There was no doubt, no hesitation, and he was cold-blooded. As if such a task for him is a normal job, calm and emotionless, with the same frequency. The blows to the man's face started to continue again, and Yamadura continued to beat him. He threw blow after blow. It was obvious that violence was commonplace for Yamadura. After a while, Yamadura finally got up, standing over the man's body and looking down at him. He lay in a pool of his own blood, not bothering to move. The blonde-haired man said that now he can make a choice, which he prefers, fingers on the right hand or on the right foot. The man's eyes widened, staring wildly at the ceiling. Sweat began to fall from his face, so this was how the Yakuza really were. It was sunset outside. An orange sun shone on many buildings. Several of the men in the room were sitting on their knees, including the one Yamadura had beaten the day before, with their hands folded on them and their heads bowed. Behind them were two girls in school uniforms. A voice said that they had started all this business on their own, without permission from above. The voice was Yamadura's, standing in front of them, stretching his shoulders. Taiga was standing on one side of him, and on the other was a demure girl with glasses, her arms crossed in front of her and her head lowered. The beaten man shouted loudly that he could not say anything, because otherwise he would simply be killed. Yamadura grinned maliciously and looked at him from under his brows, telling him that they would start with one, and that he could choose which finger to use. The man immediately waved his hands and said that so be it, he understood everything. He lowered his head and started saying that they were based out of town on a farm. Yamadura specified which farm he was talking about. He clarified that it looked like an ordinary farm, nothing out of the ordinary, and the blonde man confirmed and said that it was a working way not to attract too much attention. Yamadura turned to the dark-haired man and asked Taiga what they should do. The guy replied that his goal was to cover up the business with Datas. Yamadura asked if they should stay here in this case, and the guy confirmed that most likely. Another new voice interrupted their conversation. The bespectacled man walked over to them and told them that if they were done, they should let him take care of everything else. Yamadura asked who he was, and the man replied with a smile on his face that he definitely wasn't their enemy at the moment, and wouldn't that be enough for now. Yamadura said that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the man confirmed it with a smile. He approached Yamadura from behind and placed something on his shoulder and asked if he could stick it on for him in a prominent place. Yamadura looked down at the hand on his shoulder. It was an orange sticker with a black design in the form of a stack of bills, on which was the symbol of an animal's paw. He also approached the bespectacled girl and placed an identical sticker in her hands, telling her to do the same. The same thing was done with Taiga. The man with glasses told them to go out through the main entrance, and that they couldn't go out through the back one. The girl carefully and thoughtfully looked at the sticker. The three of them turned around and Yamadura waved at him, telling him to clean up the place while they left. The man said nothing in reply. A sudden voice from one of the men on his knees asked him if he was an immortal to just let them go, and what would he do there alone. The man grinned, saying that they were fools. A hostile aura began to radiate from the man's very essence. He turned to them and said that they were all incredibly empty-headed to think that he had come here alone. Taiga, Yamadura, and the girl left the building. They were met by a crowd of people in matching jackets, completely surrounding the entrance. Taiga only said that everything was clear now. They started to walk through the crowd as they parted in two lines. People continued to look at them with hostility. This sticker that he gave them was needed so that they could safely leave here. Yamadura stuck it on his shoulder, Taiga on the chest of his robe. They walked past the crowd and no one touched them. 3 people were lying on their knees facing the floor, their hands tied behind their backs. There was also a girl among them, who was sitting on her knees, not facing the ground, with her hands tied behind her back. Another girl was slapped across the face so hard that she fell on her side. The girl with the long red hair clenched her teeth tightly and angrily shouted out to the man who hit her what he was doing. After all, they did not interfere with anyone. The bespectacled man replied with the same smile that if she knew Midorikai, she might as well know cats and chips. He asked if she had ever heard of them. The girl frowned and said it was the first time she'd ever heard it, to which he said it was obvious. He asked her if she started at all. The bespectacled man, who continued to smile maliciously, was the executive director of the Cats organization and Chips Natsume Hasu. The girl immediately squealed and said it wasn't her. She turned her head to the other girl with her hands tied and said that she was the one who had been telling her what to do all this time, and that was why she was the only one who needed help. She called her Anna. Anna looked at her in surprise. Natsume looked at her with a smile on his face. Anna calmly closed her eyes and called the girl the most affectionate words, to which the red-haired girl only grinned maliciously. Suddenly, that girl's face was hit by another blow to the jaw from Natsume, causing her to be thrown backwards on her back. Her face was covered with bruises on both sides. She sighed heavily and asked why this was happening to her. Natsume moved closer and grabbed her hair, forcing her to raise her head and look at him. He told her that she should have lied and that she was the one who started the whole business. Tears started to fall from the girl's eyes, and she opened her mouth and started shouting loudly that it wasn't her and that it was all Anna's doing. Natsume smiled indifferently and replied that he didn't really care which one of them was really at fault anyway. He swung his fist and added that he had already decided from the very beginning that he would blow her face off. The girl loudly shouted out why, and the man said to take a closer look at Anna, answering that she was a beauty, but on the contrary she was ugly and the real one. Large tears welled up in the girl's eyes, and at the same time, another blow landed in her face. She coughed, and blood sprayed from her mouth and nose. The girl fell to the ground, unconscious. Natsume, with a smile on his face, turned to Anna and told her that she was in for something completely different and that she could become one of the best products. And that was why he would have to be gentle with her, because he didn't want her to break down prematurely. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. A girl with long dark hair was walking down the hall of the restaurant, clutching a folder. The daddy situation that Soma was involved in was resolved by Banjo and his older unknown. The police raided the karaoke place where the business was based. It was said that several people were arrested. Among those arrested were not their students. Only Erika Kusumoto, the girl with the long red hair involved, and Anna Shiraishi. Both of them are missing. The school has put them on the wanted list and the police are now looking for them. The woman opened the classroom doors and looked inside. However, despite everything, she was still worried about their safety. Also, Soma, who decided to turn off this road, seems to have made friends. The woman turned around to see a bespectacled girl named Soma surrounded by two other female students, who were having fun talking to each other. One of the girls took out her phone, showing a picture of 5 men. She happily announced that she was able to get tickets to their Spade concert. Another girl asked in surprise that how she managed to get them. Soma asked which spades they were talking about, to which the other two girls exclaimed in surprise and asked if she didn't know about them and that they were the most popular idol group right now. Soma nodded in understanding. One of the girls pointed towards the desk with a smile and said that Shin from Spade is in their class, but rarely comes, just like today he didn't come. Soma asked in surprise if this was really true, and the other girl exclaimed and asked how she could not have known about it. She showed the screen of her phone where a guy with blonde hair, green eyes, and a patch on his forehead appeared. The girl said it was him, and Soma said she had actually seen him before. The girl with the dark hair said that even though he was studying with them, it was still hard to approach him because he was quite unsociable. Another exclaimed and said that it was a good thing and meant that he doesn't have relationships with his fans. A dark-haired girl asked another one with short brown hair who she liked from Spade, and she said definitely Picasso. It was a guy with a wolf haircut, a dark upper part and a light lower part, with bright yellow eyes and a lip piercing. She said he had an incredibly cool tattoo, a mark on his cheek. The girl clarified and asked if she really liked tattoos, and another girl turned to Soma and said that tattoos are cool, and did the girl herself share her position. Soma considered her words. She took out an A4 album and quickly started drawing something in it. Soma asked if they counted, and showed her a drawing of a man who had his back turned and had a huge dragon tattoo all over his back. The girls hesitantly said that it was certainly a tattoo, but this kind of tattoo was only used by the Yakuza and they were not in fashion at all. They thoughtfully asked if there were any Yakuza left in their time, and the other one replied that if there were, it would probably be some old geezer. Soma looked down and blushed deeply. She said quietly that she didn't care about his age, and the girls looked at her questioningly. Another answered and said that she understood what she was talking about, and that she apparently likes calm and grown-up men, behind whom you will feel like behind a stone wall. A boy with bright red hair who was watching them nearby noticed what they were talking about. He said what kind of nonsense they were talking there at all. Another student sitting on the desk asked if he was so interested, and it was obvious that they were discussing a plan to capture hearts, and they were thinking about how to win the heart of a grown man. The guy with the red hair shook his head and said that he didn't understand anything. The student who was sitting on the desk grinned and said that their janitor could be an example, to which the young man started up in surprise and the other one replied that he should relax and now the master of love Tanabe would give him good advice. Another young man came up and asked Tanabe if he had ever had a girlfriend himself, and the red-haired man said that he probably hadn't even held a girl's hand, to which Tanabe complained that they should stop talking immediately, and that he had something that the two of them didn't have, namely dating experience. Tanabe jumped off and frowned, clenching his hand into a fist and loudly declaring that he had a girlfriend in elementary school. At that, both of them fell silent, just looking at him, which made Tanabe grudgingly tell them to stop looking at him like that. Tanabe cleared his throat and, with a flushed face, began to talk about how the secret of love was simple, namely, constant contact. Love means constant walks and constant communication. The blonde guy with a smile on his face replied that he was just saying the obvious things, and the red-haired guy on the contrary thought about it. The bell rang. The girl with the long black hair started up and said that class was already starting. The guy continued to look thoughtfully at the girls. Lunch break. The girls were sitting at a table in the cafeteria eating lunch, and the other students were also sitting at their own tables. Suddenly, a girl with long hair named Shoko was called out by someone. It was the red-haired guy. He said they could hang out after school for the first time in a long time. Shoko looked at him in surprise, but after a moment, with a grim expression on her face, she replied curtly that she didn't. The boy jumped at the reaction. This was said without a shred of doubt. Shoko closed her eyes and replied that the tournament was coming up soon and there was quite a lot of work to be done in the circle. The guy frowned a little and thought to himself that he had completely forgotten about the track and field club. The guy tried to keep a straight face and asked again what about meeting up after the tankard. Shoko abruptly changed the subject and asked him why he left the football club, and the guy answered the question with a question and asked what it had to do with it. The girl didn't say anything at first, but then she told him to stop hanging out with all sorts of delinquents because he was her childhood friend. And because of it, people look at her strangely. The guy immediately blushed and replied, didn't she care who he was talking to, and it was better for her to stop lecturing again. Shoko abruptly got up from the table and replied that in that case, he could do whatever he wanted. She turned to leave, and the guy didn't have time to say anything in surprise and gritted his teeth viciously, kicking a chair behind the table. Shoko changed into a sports uniform and ran a distance. The area behind the school was enclosed by a green grid. Shoko was running, her face dripping with sweat. She stopped and the guy with the stopwatch told her with a smile that it was a great result, and raising her hand up, she replied that next time she would run last. A red-haired guy stood nearby with his back to the girl and silently watched her. Inwardly, he thought that she should have finished soon, and if he waited for her for a while, they could spend some time together. As he walked past, he heard two voices in the doorway. One of them indignantly asked about being right here, and that they were at school. The guy looked around the alley and saw a girl standing near the wall and a guy opposite her. The guy told the girl that the morning and evening were not enough for him. He asked her if this was the first time she had ever done this, and she replied hesitantly that she had already had practice, but it was a long time ago and her body no longer remembers anything. The red-haired boy continued to watch them, his cheeks turning a little red. He hid abruptly, covering his mouth with his hand, and then looked back at the couple and wondered what they were doing there anyway. He saw a scene of a guy sitting on a unicycle with his legs stretched out and pressed against him. The startled girl looked at him and said in surprise, what would happen if someone suddenly saw what they were doing here? The boy's face darkened, and he came out of his hiding place and asked what they were doing here. The confused girl immediately started up when she heard someone else's voice. The girl was pedaling on a unicycle and turned to the guy, calling him a kakawa, and said that it wasn't what he thought it was. Akikawa exclaimed that it wasn't that he thought anything wrong, he had no idea what was going on here at all. Taiga was spinning the wheels of another bike and said that they were just training here, and if he wanted to, he could join them, to which Akikawa replied that no way. Taiga said that he had a good shot, which means he had potential, and it will be very useful for him. Akikawa replied that he was actually trying to beat him up, and why was he suddenly so friendly with him? Taiga replied with a calm face that it was never too late to start making friends. Akikawa said nothing. Taiga added that as his master had taught him, it was better to get along with people rather than immediately get into a fight with them. While he was talking about it, Taiga bent one leg and held onto the unicycle with one foot. Akikawa grudgingly replied that he was lying because he was the one who started waving his fists first, and Taiga replied that he only used force when it was necessary, and they didn't really need to fight right now. Akikawa thought about it, looking down and blushing slightly. He indignantly shouted at Taiga not to talk to him like he knew everything. Taiga continued to take various forms on the bike, with his legs crossed behind his head and his hands clasped in a prayer gesture. He asked what Akikawa was doing here anyway. Akikawa started to say something, but then wondered what he was really doing here. He abruptly turned his back on them and said that it was nothing, and that he was already leaving. Taiga nodded while standing with his head on the bike, and the girl smiled awkwardly and waved at him, telling him to be careful. Akikawa thought about Taiga's words as he walked back. Good shot. He remembered kicking the ball, running across the field with his teammate, waving at him about it. To pass a pass, and how he ran past it, scoring a goal against opponents and missing. How Akikawa ran up to him and grabbed him by the collar and said something while the guy just gritted his teeth and didn't say anything. Akikawa's jaw tightened. He thought that being free with this bunch of fools, Jajima, Tanabe, and being friends with the older members of Midori Kakawa was the best option for him. Akikawa took out his orange phone while looking at the screen. A bell appeared with the name written on it. That's right, this was where he belonged. Akikawa answered the phone with a smile on his face, holding it to his ear. The voice on the phone said there was going to be a party over the weekend and asked if he was going to attend. Akikawa smiled nervously and stammered back that of course he would come. Gadu, a huge dark-skinned man with a smile on his face, added that Akikawa was supposed to be friends with a pretty nice girl named Shoko Heroes and that he should call her too. Akikawa froze in place. Godot sat covered in one towel and surrounded by two blonde women and said that he needed a new woman and that the old ones were all broken. Gadu kept pushing and asking if Akikawa was okay with it, and they were each other's friends. Akikawa listened to all this with a face full of horror. Sweat dripped from his face in large drops. Outside, the sun shone down on the two-story building. Akikawa shouted indignantly, grabbing the boy by the collar of his shirt and telling him that he should have passed him a pass. In response, the guy yelled at him to shut up and that he didn't come to their club class himself, so what was the point of giving him a pass? There was an argument between the two of them, and Akikawa shouted back that he was actually training on his own, apart from the others. And the young man replied that you couldn't learn much that way, and he should have understood that perfectly well, and plus, was it really so important for him that he scored the goal? And did he really not know that the main thing was not his personal result? The other guys from the team came closer. The guy replied to Akikawa that he, unfortunately, could not consider a person like him as his companion. That's why he quit football. It will be better only with your own, so everything is much easier. And then a year ago, he met me. Tanabe clenched his fist in displeasure and shouted that he would definitely not lose in rock, paper, scissors, and that today he would drink free soda and definitely win. Tanabe stood in front of the blonde while Akikawa stood in front of them and watched the peculiar exchange. All three of them began to give out a piece, and a total of 1 stone and 2 leaves fell out. In the end, Tanabe won, and Akikawa dramatically grabbed his head and said that he still lost, and the blonde added that so be it, she took him. Tanabe happily clenched his hands into fists and smiled broadly. Their triumph was interrupted by a man approaching them. It was Godot, a huge, tall man with a solid build and dreadlocks tied up in a bun. He smiled viciously and started to flex his fist, asking if they were the strongest among the first years. The boys looked uncertainly at the big man and the people behind him and asked if he needed anything. Gadu moved closer and leaned in between the blonde and Akikawa, putting his arm around their shoulders, telling them with a grim smile that they should go with him and that he liked strong guys like them. They looked at him uncertainly. They knew that this guy was dangerous, and would they really have to fight him? After a while, they found themselves in a bowling alley. Godot threw the ball, causing all the pins in the row to fly in different directions and knocking out a strike. His face was stern and intent. He turned to the boys and gave them a thumbs up, and Tanabe threw out his arms in a solemn gesture. The next time they were at karaoke, singing songs, Goda sat next to the blonde man with a friendly arm around his shoulder. Then they played basketball. Akikawa was holding the ball, facing 2 guys, and saw Gadu running past him, passing him a pass. Godot immediately intercepted the ball and ran it into the ring, hanging onto it. Gadu confidently raised his hand up, clenching it into a fist as the others ran towards him. Godot happily exclaimed that they were the best. Akikawa smiled, breathing heavily. He was thinking about how much fun it had been with this guy of the year. The boys were wiping the sweat from their faces, and Tanabe said with a smile on his face that Goda was completely different, and the blonde added that he would never have thought that Goda was such a person. Goda walked over to Akikawa, rubbing his neck and asking for his name. The boy hesitantly confirmed that his name was Akikawa. The man gave him a thumbs up and smiled, furrowing his brows and telling him that he was cool and the pass was great. Akikawa blushed slightly at his words, smiling happily. It turned out that there are more fun things than circles. From then on, they hung out every day for a year. The time was 12 o'clock. Goda was sitting on a bench, holding a can of soda and crossing his legs. He leaned on the bench and said something was missing. He turned to the guys and said that everything seemed boring to him lately, and the guys were surprised. Goda grinned. He said that since they were friends, he wanted to show them something. Goda smiled grimly, glancing at the guys behind him. He ordered them to follow him. After a while, they were in front of the building's doors. Goda opened the doors and said with a smile on his face that he was going to show them a great place. The boys jumped up, standing in the doorway to the room. They saw a lot of strange men and women, all of them drinking alcohol. On the table were unfamiliar pills, syringes, and weapons. Someone was lying on the floor, someone on the couch. The boys froze in place. Goda smiled contentedly and turned to the guys, saying that on the other hand, this was still not enough for them, because they were only first-year students. But it's okay, they will get used to it. The boys' faces were grim, and none of them uttered a word. A year later, he sat down on the couch, hugging two women and adding that immediately after they get used to it, they will already understand how cool it is. Akikawa stared at the scene in front of him in horror. He tried to think that everything was fine, that if he ignored it, he was a good person. If he just pretends that he didn't see anything, then his life will remain the same as it was before. Akikawa clenched his hand into a fist. He lowered his head, gritting his teeth tightly. That's what he always did. However, Shoko shouldn't have gotten involved with all of this. It was already night outside. Akikawa was sitting on the floor of his room, leaning against the back of the sofa. He called the guys. The blonde man said that he understood everything, but asked why it was needed. Akikawa nervously shouted out that he had no idea, and that all he ever wanted to do was have fun all the time. Tanabe smiled. He said that it couldn't be helped, and that it was time for Master Love Tanabe to step in. Akikawa didn't answer the question. Tanabe went on to say that he just wanted some pretty girl, didn't he? And that in that case, he would just seduce someone and just persuade her to go with him. Akikawa hesitantly replied that it was unlikely to help, to which the guy told him not to worry and he would definitely have time to find someone for him. Akikawa tried to say something else, but Tanabe laughed and said with a smile on his face that it was finally time for his pickup techniques. Akikawa tried to reach out to him and tell him to stop ignoring him already, to which the blonde replied that it was useless, the guy was already lost. The next day, after apologizing for the intrusion, Soma entered the office and Taiga greeted her. Soma looked around uncertainly and asked in confusion if Yamadura was there. Taiga replied that he didn't work at the school, and why should he even be here? Soma replied sheepishly, which made sense in principle. Taiga asked what she wanted, and the girl replied that Hero's Shiko wanted to consult him. Shiko came in and said that Yuki told her that Taiga was the one who closed the daddy business office. Taiga was startled at her words, but with the same calm face, he said that the consultation obviously had something to do with delinquents again. Shoko looked down at the floor uncertainly, clutching her in her hand and unsure of the right way to start. Shoko started by saying that Akikawa and the other boys in X class had been acting very strange lately. Taiga clarified what she meant. With a grim expression on her face, the girl explained that they hadn't talked for a long time, and then he abruptly decided to invite her to hang out with him, and Tanabe also constantly began to hit on other girls. Shoko's brow furrowed as she considered her own words. She pulled out her phone from her pocket and showed Taiga the screen where the conversation was open. Shoko said her friend gave it to her. It was a correspondence with Tanabe, in which he wrote to her classmate that he had a new way to have fun and was not interested in it, but the girl refused and sent him in a rude form to hell. Shoko asked the man if he knew who Goda was, and he shook his head. The girl explained that it was a high school student who has always a lot of problems, and 3 of their guys with him just recently began to communicate. Soma chimed in and said that it was one of the Midorikikai performers and that she had heard other people talking about it. Taiga looked thoughtfully in their direction and asked if they were talking about the Midorikikai, the organization that just dealt with. The girl replied that it was true. Shoko replied with a grim face that in her opinion, if you don't intervene as soon as possible, then everything can end badly and it will be too late. Taiga calmly replied that he had heard her and what exactly she wanted. Shoko clenched her fist, her face serious. She replied that she only wanted him to help clean up the school. Taiga immediately replied that he would help, to which Shoko exclaimed in surprise. Taiga seriously replied that the situation in the school directly affects its cleanliness. Soma and Shoko thanked the man, bowing low to show their gratitude. Shoko raised her head and asked Taiga what exactly was he going to do. The guy replied that he already had one very good idea. After a while, a beautiful girl appeared in front of them. Long hair, flawless face, beautiful clothes. It was Taiga. The disguise was complete. Shoko asked in surprise if it was too cool for him to do it. Taiga replied that in his previous job, he had never changed into a woman before. Shoko wondered if he used to work as a hostess or something. Taiga turned around and said that all that was left was to contact Tanabe, and the girl stopped him. With a serious face, Shoko said that she would go with him. Taiga looked at her over his shoulder. Shoko added that she wants to see with her own eyes what exactly is going on there. Taiga didn't say anything, but after a few seconds, he agreed. He added that it could be quite dangerous, but he respected her determination. By next week, Shoko was standing next to the girl disguised Taiga. They went inside and saw people walking and having fun. It was the site of a Midorikikai party. The blonde in the pink dress let out a cry of joy. Isn't that funny? And Shoko smiled uncertainly and confirmed her words, thinking to herself that she was playing along very badly. Suddenly, a man walked up to them and put his arm around Taiga's shoulders, inviting such a beauty to have a drink with him. Shoko immediately panicked and thought to herself that this was too bad, and that although the disguise looked good on the outside, if they suddenly started touching him, they would easily guess everything. Suddenly, the man hugging Taiga said that there was a strange feeling. The voice shouted loudly that it was a man and that there was a trance among the girls. The voice in my head started to panic, wondering if they'd been discovered after all. Suddenly, a strange girl fell to the floor. Shoko and Taiga looked in the direction where the fight had started. One of the men approached the girl and hit her, loudly asking who brought her here. The dark-haired man came over and hesitantly replied that it was him and that he was sorry, and the enraged blonde asked what he was even thinking. The guy replied that he had a very feminine voice and that he was as surprised as he was. The blonde man approached him and said with displeasure that he couldn't even bring a girl with him and that such a person only deserved to die. He swung his fist, intending to hit him, but a man came up behind him and put his hand on the man's shoulder. With a smile on his face, he told the blonde to stop already. The blonde looked at the big man in surprise and then added that people just have different tastes. The man didn't immediately understand what he meant, and then, with a grim smile from under his brow, he added that he had brought him here precisely because he thought he was beautiful, didn't he? Several people surrounded the man. Goda grabbed a guy in disguise by the scruff of the neck and told him to show him exactly what he was doing to him. The man screamed loudly, and his cry echoed throughout the room. The three guys standing around looked at this scene with a dark and shocked expression. Tanabe looked away nervously and said that someone must have dragged a man in disguise here. It seemed that the man was older than him and made such a stupid mistake. Someone asked Tanabe and clarified that he, said the opposite about bringing two beauties here. Akikawa said thoughtfully that he honestly didn't expect this to happen. The blonde asked where exactly the two girls were and that he hadn't seen Tanabe interact with any of them, even though he was the one who had brought them here. Tanabe replied with a nervous smile that he was wondering where they might be. The blonde looked at him with displeasure and asked if he had even heard their voices, and Tanabe replied that they had texted him that they were interested in the Midorikikai party. Akikawa folded his arms and looked away, telling him not to talk about how he really fell for it, and Tanabe scolded him to shut up and tell him that he was sad because of him. Tanabe said with a smile that they probably just wanted to meet someone from Midorikikai. I was sure of it. The blonde asked if he meant that they liked dangerous and bad guys, and Tanabe said how could he say no to them. Shoko stared at the stage with a grim face, her eyes wide. It was too cruel. Taiga was standing behind her. The man next to Taiga called out in displeasure and told them not to pay attention to it, and it was better for them to forget about them and have fun. The man handed the bottle to Shoko and asked if she would drink it, and the girl replied that she was underage. The man smiled in surprise and asked, "Is this really true and even minors are allowed to attend this party?" Shoko asked if it was just juice. A man with a cap pulled down over his eyes came up to them and put a glass on the table. He asked if an orange one would do. The girl thanked him and took the glass in her hands, taking only a small sip, but a loud voice told her to stop. They turned in the direction of the noise. The two men were surrounded by a crowd of people. They were barely able to stand, completely beaten up. In her opinion, it was too cruel, but at least the locals were kind to the girls, and if she interfered, they would definitely have to stop. Suddenly, Shoko's mind began to blur. For some reason, her head began to spin. A distant voice said in surprise that it was too fast, and apparently he went a little too far with the dosage. Shoko caught a glimpse of Banjo, who was also lying face down on the table. Shoko fell to the floor. She was very cold, and there was darkness everywhere. She didn't know where she was. She only felt that it was very warm and very cold. Suddenly, she opened her eyes. When she regained consciousness, the first thing she saw was a long chain running from her neck. Shoko was sitting in a huge cage. Cattles were on his arms and neck. She realized that something had been spiked in her drink. Realizing the whole situation, the girl began to call out loudly for Banjo, but he was nowhere to be found. Shoko clenched her hands tightly into fists and hung her head. How could it have turned out like this? The girl began to tremble and think that all this was because of Yusei, and it would be better if she didn't get involved at all. Then she wouldn't have had to find herself in the situation she was in now. A voice interrupted her thoughts, calling her number 3. The man came up to the cage and said it was her turn. She noticed a third number taped to her chest. She was released from the cage, led by a chain past many men. She couldn't even imagine what would happen to her now. All of a sudden, they were brought to a stage where several other similar girls were standing. All of them were shackled, standing on a lighted stage with their backs to the audience. Goda was smiling smugly, rubbing his chin. He happily stated that this time they had gathered a bunch of beauties. Goda was sitting on a raised platform in the middle of the stands. Shoko turned to look at him. She saw a man flanked by 2 beautiful women. Goda took a closer look and said that one girl was missing, and that he remembered her exactly. It was a girl with a good build. The man raised his hand and said that the person who was supposed to take her out has not returned for quite a decent time. Goda clicked his tongue in displeasure and said that he liked her the best of all of them. However, after a second, he waved it off and said that it wasn't that important, and among the options presented to him, they were still quite good girls. While Goto was looking at the girls on stage, he licked his lips viciously with his big tongue. Shoko frowned seriously. She knew that there was no way to stay here, and she had to wait for an opportunity to escape from here. Goto snapped his fingers and said it was time to start. A huge cage appeared on the stage, blocking the girls' view from all sides. Chains extended from the top of the structure, lifting the cage walls higher. Shoko looked at the railings in surprise. There was no way she could escape now. Goto grinned and shouted loudly at them not to just stand there and beat each other to a pulp until there was only one girl left. Shoko looked at him in surprise. Goto added, rubbing his chin with a smile and saying that he was not interested in weak women, and that it was a real pleasure to subdue a strong woman. He went on to add that the losers would be eliminated, and the winner would be his woman. Goto smiled madly and licked his finger, adding a last word to make them turn him on. He turned to a man standing nearby, who snapped to attention and told him to bring him a girl who wasn't in the arena until the fight was over, and if he didn't make it, he would die. The man immediately took off, saying that he would quickly bring her here. The chains around the girls' necks were gone, as were the shackles in various places. With a mad smile and burning eyes, Goto ordered the battle to begin. The three kids were also standing in the middle of the hall. The blonde man looked around the room and asked them if they thought that the crowd around them was somehow much smaller. Tanabe was drinking a drink and said that it wasn't uncommon for it to be a party, so some people were leaving, and it made sense that some people would come here for a couple of hours. The blonde man confirmed his words uncertainly. Both of them looked unsure of what they were saying. The blonde man asked if they wanted to go home, and besides, Goto was nowhere to be seen, and Tanabe said that the two girls he brought were also nowhere to be seen. Akakawa said that in the end, they never met them. Suddenly, an object on the floor caught his attention. When he picked it up, he looked at it carefully and said that they had similar student cards at school. Akakawa's face paled as he took a closer look. He looked at the name in shock. This couldn't be true. Why was student Shoko here? Indeed, the document contained a portrait of the girl and data written on the side. Goto ordered the battle to begin immediately, licking his lips with a bloodthirsty smile. He shouted for them to fight for the right to be with him. The biggest of the girls grinned. She clenched her hands into fists and slammed them together, her eyes lighting up. Her hair was short and red, and her body was large and muscular. The girl said that it was too easy, and that if she just killed them all, then she would have the opportunity to wring the neck of that guy on top of her. It was the #1 fight. The other girl standing to the side was smoking a cigarette. She had long blonde hair. She mockingly asked what kind of neck they were talking about, and that Mr. Alex should paw it, and she would beat everyone here to a pulp. It was girl #2, a redneck. Shoko said nothing and swallowed nervously, looking around. Her number was 3, track and field. The girl with 2 ponytails tied at the side sighed in displeasure. She was sitting on the floor with her legs crossed and her hands behind her head and said that it was somehow unfair because she was not in her weight class. It was #4, Bangaru. Another girl in a sports uniform with a short haircut came forward and said that she wasn't interested in what the reward was, and if they want, they can attack. It was #5, Karate. The last girl, #6, was shaking as she clutched her hand. She stared at the scene in front of her and said, "Why did it turn out this way?" "This is #6, Ballet." The girls looked at each other. The biggest of them, #1, said that if you beat everyone, then why not start with the strongest one? She turned to the girl at #5 and she asked what she needed. The girl came closer and asked #5 what exactly she did and if it was martial arts. #5 replied with a serious face that karate is an unusual martial art and it builds up the spirit. #1 listened to her with a smile on her face and snapped her fingers and said that she would be fine. Pointing towards #5 with her finger, she told her that the girl would be the first. #1 immediately sped up, rushing at the girl at full speed. With a crazy smile, she told her to let #5 amuse her a little longer. #5 barely managed to dodge. #1 was very fast. #5 only thought that she couldn't compete with her in pure strength for sure. #5 took a stance with her fist in front of her. Despite the difference in their weight and build, #1's actions were easy enough to read. And if #5 makes it, he can win with just one punch. However, as soon as the girl swung, the blow missed. #1 managed to dodge in time. She hung like a huge shadow over the girl and grabbed #5, knocking her over and taking the girl for a chokehold. #5 gritted her teeth and couldn't believe what had just happened. How could she move her center of gravity so easily? #1 smiled maliciously and told the girl that #5 could start crying, and #1 actually had many titles. Among them were finalist of the World Junior Wrestling Championship, 3-time Junior Wrestling Champion in Japan, winner of the competition for the title of the strongest in his generation, champion of the Asian Wrestling Championship, winner of the competition for the title of the strongest in her generation, winner of the All Greens Championship Cup, 4th place in the men's and women's wrestling competition. However, even all of these rewards were nothing more than trinkets to her. The rules in wrestling only limited her. She was tired of this pampered world. and that's why she immersed herself in the world of violent street fighting. She used a wrestling technique to grab the opponent and then used choking techniques that are forbidden in normal wrestling. Number 1 continued to ring number 5 so hard that the girl began to tremble. Number 1 asked if she had learned to live by the rules within the walls of her dojo, a good and well-behaved girl, she would never beat her. Shoko ran up to them in horror and told them to stop, because at this rate she would kill her. Number 1 smirked and asked, wasn't it obvious from the beginning that she was going to kill her? Shoko ran over and grabbed her arm, trying to move it somehow. Shoko wrapped one of her hands in both of hers, and number 1 let go of number 5 in surprise and jumped out of the way. The other girls looked at the scene in surprise and didn't understand what had just happened. Number 1 was looking at Shoko, who was holding number 5 and trying to bring her to her senses. Number 1 decided that Shoko was trying to break her fingers with this move. There were various ways to get out of the grip by hand, and the simplest, but forbidden way is to break the finger of the hand that holds in the grip. Shoko wanted to do it without hesitation, she was sure of it. Was it really not that simple? Suddenly, the girl with the ponytails laughed loudly, clutching her stomach. She said through laughter that it was extremely hilarious how such a huge thing suddenly got scared and ran away. Number 2 turned towards the girl in displeasure and shouted out to her, is she really that strong to laugh at them like that? But the girl immediately spread her hands and told her not to be so angry, and that in the first place, she was not interested in winning or losing, she was not interested in the prospect of being in the arms of a gorilla as number 2, and that she would never give up on her. Number 2 smirked, thanking her but telling her to listen to her carefully. Number 2's face immediately twisted in anger and she clarified who this girl had just called a gorilla, and that she didn't dare to insult Mr. Alex like that. The men behind the cage started asking loudly and saying whether they were going to fight at all or not, and didn't they understand what would happen to them if they lost. They'll have fun anyway, but what the girls should do is another matter. Loud, nasty laughter echoed throughout the space. Number 5 scratched her head and said that she didn't really want to be in the arms of a gorilla, and she didn't really want to die in their arms either. Number 2 yelled out that she was already tired of talking, and the girl immediately put her hands up and asked her to slow down a little and that she didn't really like pain. However, number 2 didn't even listen to her, swinging her fist at her, but number 4 managed to strike first. Number 2 staggered back, the blow catching her jaw. In the next second, she fell to the ground. Number 4 took a fighting stance. She said she had warned me that she didn't like pain, and that her hands hurt after being hit, even though she had tried to warn me. Shoko watched it all with a frightened face. Number 4 had scared her, and it was clear that she was strong enough. It looked adequate, and you can negotiate with it in case of something. Number 4 turned to number 1 and told her to get this giant woman over to her quickly, and that she wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. Number 1 stared at her indignantly. Number 4 said that even though she was used to wearing gloves, number 1 should definitely be as soft as a whipping toy so she could make a chop out of it. Number 4 quickly stepped up next to number 1, intending to punch her right in the jaw. The girl was taken aback by surprise and did not react immediately, having only managed to cover herself from the barrage of her blows. She realized it was a boxer. The punches were incredibly fast, but too weak for no one. No matter how much number 4 hits her, her body can withstand all the blows. As long as she's protecting her chin, she might just break through. Only this number 4 will not win. Number 1 broke through to the girl, opening her arms and intending to grab her, but number 4 did the opposite, and because the girl opened up, she hit her right in the stomach. Number 1 doubled over, clutching her stomach. She couldn't believe that such a small body had such an incredible impact force. Number 4 grinned and turned around, clenching her hand into a fist. She said that the girl was incredibly stupid, because she did not understand that you also need to be able to hit correctly. Shoko watched in surprise as number 4 won. She smiled nervously and thought that since that crazy whopper had lost, she might as well try talking to number 4 normally. Shoko hesitantly raised her hand and started to address number 4 and say that now they should discuss everything, what exactly they will do next. However, her words were interrupted by a loud bang. Shoko opened her eyes and looked at the pile of bodies lying around number 4. Shoko asked her in horror what she had done, and the girl calmly replied that she couldn't just walk out of here if she didn't win the fight first. Number 4 took up a fighting stance, jumping up and down on the spot and beckoning Shoko to attack first. Shoko was thinking in a panic about what she should do, and couldn't there be another way. She thought of Mr. Banjo. Akikawa's loud voice rang out throughout the building, demanding to let the 3 of them pass. They were standing in the hallway in front of the entrance, which was blocked by several guys. One of them replied that Mr. Goto was currently having fun and should not be disturbed. Akikawa shouted loudly that Shoko might be there right now, and that she was a typical nerd who didn't know how to fight at all. One of the men ordered him to shut up immediately, because he was the right-hand man of the year, and that even in this state of affairs, they still dared to contradict him. The blonde didn't bother to listen to him too much, and his fist landed squarely in the man's face. A few other guys at the entrance started making a fuss and talking about how Masuda had just been knocked out. The blonde man calmly said that you need to listen to your elders, and Akikawa was his friend long before he joined Midorikikai, and if they didn't let them pass, he would destroy every single one of them with his own hands. Number 4 was beckoning the girl to attack. Shoko held her hand and asked her what she was just saying and that there was no one else who wanted to fight. Shoko tried to calm the girl down and held up her hand, telling them to calm down and think about how they could get out of here. Number 4 said that Shoko should understand everything herself, that there was no way out, there was only one way out. Shoko tried to get through to the girl anyway and said that that was why she was suggesting that she come up with something. But number 4 interrupted her and said that she had to fight, and only then would she be able to leave here. Shoko said that she had never fought, to which number 4 grinned and charged at the girl with her fists. However, a second later, as soon as her fist was a couple of centimeters away from Shoko's face, she stopped. Shoko was standing in the same spot. Number 4 turned away from her and told her not to think she was a fool, and that Shoko had calculated the range of her punch perfectly. A person who hadn't fought once wouldn't be able to dodge so perfectly. However, Shoko put her hand to her chest and said that it was the absolute truth and that she really had never fought in her life. However, they still managed to teach her exactly how to defend herself. Taiga and Shoko were standing behind the house. The man told her that before they went there, he would teach her something. The man held up a finger and told her exactly what to do if she got into a dangerous situation. Shoko nodded and listened intently. Taiga began to describe that they needed to consider several options for when the enemy had a weapon and when they didn't. In both cases, the enemy's attack range will be limited, with a long arm or a long leg. In the case of a weapon, the length of the arm and the size of the weapon. There is always a limit to everything. If you keep your distance, you won't get hurt for sure. Shoko hesitantly said that Taiga made it sound like it was very easy. Taiga replied with a calm face that if you have good reflexes and dynamic visual acuity, it shouldn't be a problem for you. Shoko raised her hand. What should I do if the enemy has a firearm? Taiga confidently folded his arms and frowned, saying that in that case, just give up. However, if there is no choice, then you need to hold out as far as possible. The further away you are, the harder it will be to hit you. Shoko listened intently. Taiga added that the most important thing is that no matter whether the enemy is armed or not, you need to remain calm. Shoko looked down. At the same time, number 4 launched another punch, and the girl barely managed to dodge it. Number 4 began to complain that she had already annoyed her. Shoko realized that she really wasn't hitting it, and if you keep calm and watch her punches, she will never hit it. Number 4 was thinking to herself and couldn't figure out what was wrong with Shoko. It was immediately clear that she was clearly not used to fighting, but she was just dodging and had no intention of counterattacking. Number 4 continued to swing and throw punches. She was thinking, did Shoko do this by accident? Takes out on pure talent. However, it was lucky that they were in the ring. Shoko ended up pinned against the wall of the cage. Number 4 wiped the sweat off her face and told the girl with a smile that she wouldn't be able to run away for long anyway, and that as soon as she hit the wall, she would be finished right away. Number 4 asked Shoko that she must have seen a boxing match at least once. When someone is pinned in a corner, a barrage of punches immediately descends on them. Number 4 swung, intending to throw a punch at the girl. Shoko remembered Taiga's words. He told her that he would teach Shoko how to avoid a situation where there was nowhere to run. Shoko crossed her arms and charged towards number 4. The girl didn't expect Shoko to decide to rush forward, and with the speed of her movements and her own weight, she definitely wouldn't be able to stop her. Shoko wrapped her arms around the girl's legs. She did it. Mr. Banjo had taught her that, too. Taiga said that of course, her opponent would probably understand what she was trying to achieve and think that she was just dodging. Then the enemy will just start to drive you slowly into a corner, into a dead end, against a wall or on a cliff. And then there will be nowhere to retreat. Shoko asked what she should do in such a situation, and Taiga replied with a thumbs up that it was only a leap forward. A kick or arm kick becomes powerful at speed, and when the arms or leg are fully extended, the speed will cover the lack of strength. Shoko said that it sounds difficult, because she will probably need to aim, and Taiga replied that there is an option when you don't have to aim at all, and after you break through, the enemy will be stunned. Taiga walked past the mannequin, hitting it and adding that if there is a slight weight difference between you, then after pushing the opponent's legs, you will need to put your hands where the joints are and sharply knock him down, and then you will be able to hit for sure. Taiga demonstrated everything on the dummy, grabbing it by the feet and knocking it to the ground. Number 4 stared dumbfounded at Shoko, who climbed on top of her and swung her fist over her face. Shoko was looking at her with serious eyes. The girl asked Taiga how best to strike. Taiga explained that you need to hit with your elbow to accurately knock out the opponent, and Shoko repeated the image of the banjo in her head, raising her elbow over the face of number 4. The girl looked at her in horror and surprise. She realized that she had underestimated the girl. No one had ever climbed it like this before. Unlike competitive boxing, the streets didn't have these stupid rules in a ring. It was hard to knock her down, because due to the lack of a ring, it's hard to pin her down. She just maneuvered with ease. She always worked her feet well. I honed my speed so that it would never be underestimated, but in the end I stepped on the same rake myself. She underestimated her opponent, and that's what it all led to. Now the stars will fly. Number 4 covered herself with her hands, but nothing happened. She wondered why it didn't hurt at all. Number 4 didn't understand why it was so easy. She opened her eyes and saw Shoko standing in front of her. The girl was standing in front of her in a counter. Number 4 wondered why the girl was so far away and not on top of her. Shoko remembered what Tega had told her. He said that you need to hit the elbow to knock out the opponent, and this is an ideal option. But with the power of Shoko, she is unlikely to be able to knock out a person. Before the enemy wakes up, you need to break the distance and run away. Tega asked if the girl was from the track and field club. Shoko pursed her lips. She thought to herself and asked Banjo in her head, what should she do now if there was nowhere else to run? Number 4 started to slowly get up and say that even though she didn't understand Shoko's actions, she definitely wouldn't give her a second chance. Number 4 clenched her hands tightly into fists, gritting her teeth. Goda, who was watching, was having fun. He licked his lips and giggled, saying that the ending is always the most interesting. Suddenly, someone's screams interrupted him, drawing his attention away. Goda yelled at them to stop yelling right away, because he was enjoying the show, and the man apologized and said that Jajima's boys were here. Hearing the familiar name, Shoko looked around. She saw 3 kids covered in cuts and bruises, and behind them on the floor lay the people of the years. Akakawa went to the cage and called Shoko's name, and she was surprised to see Yasei and asked him what they were doing here at all. Akakawa shouted that he would explain everything later and that they would get her out of there now. An enraged voice was heard asking them what else they were up to. His eyes were blazing fiercely, and he was looking directly at the 3 boys. Akakawa had told him that up to this point, he had turned a blind eye to everything for years, and that ignoring everything for so long didn't give him the right to say so, but he was still a man. Akakawa clenched his fist. Akakawa looked at Goda and said that he couldn't just stand there silently watching how much he wanted to hurt Shoko. Goda asked what the others were going to say. The blonde man frowned and told the older man to excuse him, but he was still Akakawa's friend. Tanabe smiled awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, giggling and telling them that he had actually told them that it might not be worth it. The blonde ran up to him and grabbed him by the collar with a furious face, still shaking him and asking him whose side he was on, and Tanabe replied that it was just that they were facing years after all. Goda grinned and surprisingly replied that they did, as it turned out, have some kind of male core after all. The guys told him that he taught them to live freely, to get out of the way of those you don't like, and now the one they don't like the most is himself, Goda. Goda jumped down from his seat, stretching his arms. He asked what happened next, and since when did they suddenly think they were stronger than him? Goda walked up to the blonde man and made a fist, driving a punch into his gut. He continued to talk about how they were going to see if they were really stronger, while using his other hand to punch Tanabe in the temple. 2 guys immediately fell down. Akakawa tried to attack from behind and kicked Goda, but he didn't move. Goda spun around and punched Akakawa in the stomach, sending him sprawling on his back and telling them to cheer him up properly. Akakawa's back hit the cage railing, and Shoko ran up to him. She asked if the guy was okay, and Yusei hesitantly replied that he was. Shoko shook and asked why he had come to save her. Goda grinned and asked if Yusei was a friend of hers. Yaosei leaned on his elbows and replied that he didn't come here to save her, but only to return what she had dropped. The guy was holding her student ID in his hand. Yaosei handed her the document, and Shoko stared at it in surprise. Yaosei stretched his neck and said that once they had dealt with this, they could start winning. However, Goda was a real monster. Tega was standing in his disguise in the building. It was now clear to him what Midorikai's true nature was. Before his eyes was a whole plantation of forbidden plants. He glanced over his shoulder at the unconscious man on the ground. He didn't even think that he would be able to find something like this. His infiltration strategy worked just fine. He had to free Yusei and the other guys. I must destroy this organization to its very foundation. And to do that, he needed proof of their crimes. Tega took out his phone from his pocket and started shooting a picture of plants in front of him, taking pictures. Evidence in the form of distribution of prohibited products on the territory of the country. He looked at the many bodies that lay scattered on the floor. They had a good security detail here. Tega took a couple of pictures and put the phone back in his pocket. He thought that Shoko had probably already waited too long for him. Suddenly, he was interrupted by a uniformed man running over. He shouted out that he had finally found the girl, and that she had somehow run too far. However, as soon as he looked down at the bodies of his colleagues, the man immediately took a step back in horror and asked what had happened here in the first place. He asked if the girl could knock them all out. Taiga turned to him and ordered him out of the way. He frowned menacingly and asked if he wanted to be on the floor in exactly the same position. The man immediately fell to the floor in fear, letting out a loud squeal. He watched Taiga leave and wondered if some girl had knocked them all out. What a shame. A dark-skinned man in a hat was holding a huge broccoli in his hands, taking a huge bite. He complained that he didn't eat enough vegetables. It was Midorikikai performer Miguel Greenwood. The employee began to giggle and said that this female gorilla should start praying, because she would never defeat Mr. Miguel, because this was an amazing man. A former boss of the overseas mafia, he was sentenced to 350 years in prison, but he escaped and disappeared into their country. The real devil. The man pointed a finger in Taiga's direction and asked if she was immediately afraid and that her hamstrings were probably shaking, but suddenly a huge broccoli flew straight into his mouth. Miguel stood over him and ordered him to shut his mouth immediately and said that he described him as if he was some kind of coward who ran away and hid. The man on the floor immediately apologized. Miguel turned to Taiga and told her that she had heard everything herself and that he was second only to Alex in terms of strength among the locals. He told her to think about it because mafia bosses are usually old men and Miguel was still quite young. He looked at Taiga carefully and asked if she understood what was being said, but the answer was no. Miguel chuckled and adjusted his hat on his head, saying that in that case, he would explain better. He had a gun in his other hand. The boys continued to fight, striking him one blow after another. The blonde man punched him in the face, but it didn't have any effect. Goda grabbed him by the shoulders and slammed his forehead into his head, causing the boy to immediately fall back. He couldn't figure out what was wrong with Goda. The blonde man got up and stood in front of him. It was as if they were looking at Iron Man and nothing less. Yause was about to throw another punch at the guy's back, but he caught sight of him just in time, glaring over his shoulder with his fierce eyes. Yause thought to himself that their blows didn't affect him at all. Yuse ran away and wanted to strike to try a different strategy, but it didn't work out. As soon as he kicked it, he immediately fell to the floor and clutched at the bruised one. He kicked out his leg, cursing loudly. Yause shivered, frowning and clenching his teeth. He couldn't believe it. It was all nonsense, and what kind of body did he even have? Goda squinted at him and grinned, saying that Yuse had learned something new after all. I've already been through a lot of fights and realized that you need to aim for the legs against strong guys, and that's why Yause thought that the legs would be a weak point for him. Goda grinned as he flexed his shoulders and added with a smile on his face that he knew absolutely nothing about human anatomy, and he had never studied any martial arts either. Yause, with a vicious expression and sweat dripping from his face, asked that was it really just a huge amount of physical strength that he had. Goda asked if there was anything else they needed besides that, because up to this point, no one's praising technique had helped them beat Goda, so why would they learn anything from such weaklings? Goda said that Yuse was just like him anyway. Goda grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, slamming a huge fist over him and adding with a crazy smile that no one else understands better than Goda himself anyway. The strongest don't need any techniques. Goda's blow landed squarely on Yuse's face. Shoko grabbed the bars and shouted the boy's name loudly. Number 4 walked over and put her hands behind her head and said out loud, I wonder if you'll survive another blow. After all, the sound was just right. Shoko turned to her sharply, provoked by her words, and the girl immediately waved her off, telling her to relax. She folded her arms across her chest and said that no one cares about them yet, so she suggests that we take a little look at how their fight will end up. Shoko asked if she was suggesting that she just watch Yause get beaten up, and number 4 asked her what she could possibly do in a different situation. Shoko clenched her hand into a fist and said that if the 3 of them lost, they would have problems again. And the girl reluctantly agreed with this, but added that she just had to believe in them, because they still might have a chance to win. Shoko glanced back at the sound of a clank and saw the blonde man already on his feet, leaning on the iron beam in his hands. He frowned and told God that he was a terrible monster, but he wasn't going to give him a second break. Number 4 said that since they couldn't beat him with their fists, it was possible that they couldn't punch him in the head with their weapons as well. The girl smirked and told Shoko that she also didn't think the guy looked much more confident with a gun in his hand. Goda grinned and asked if he was serious and that he had seen something like this in a textbook. Takuya Jajima practiced martial arts. There was no use for his skills in a fist fight. His friends didn't know anything about it either. However, he clearly felt that due to the difference in strength, he didn't have a chance with his fists. However, he was doing kendo. Takuya held up an iron beam in front of him, pointing in the direction of the ear. Now he definitely won't lose to him. Takuya Dojima was the son of a famous dojo master. In the past, he admired his father, so he devoted himself to kendo, but due to one incident, he lost confidence in the dojo. He dropped his sword and went on his way. Now, he was determined to fight seriously. Goda smirked and asked Takuya, does he really like to throw out loud words? Goda took up a stance and urged him to attack him, adding that he wouldn't leave a wet spot on the blonde. Takuya remembered his lessons. He was standing in front of a man in a sports kimono, both of them holding wooden swords pointed at each other. The basis of kendo is proper distance management. Step forward, attack, step back, retreat. He had to be able to attack and retreat in an instant. It was a lightning sword technique. Takuya charged at Goda with a peculiar sword at the ready. Goda grinned in surprise. It was necessary to understand that the enemy would not stand still. There was no need to focus on individual parts of the opponent's body and monitor the movement of the entire body. Then no matter who your opponent is, they can't escape your sword. Takuya squeezed his eyes shut and then opened them wide, frowning and looking seriously in front of him. If he knew about all these techniques, even mountains would fall before him. Find the weak point. Work with your feet. Attack. Defend yourself. The father hit Takuya on the head, hitting his protective helmet. Takuya knelt down on one knee in front of Atsu and placed his sword on the floor. The main thing was not to forget, when attacking the enemy, fill your lungs and shout at the top of your lungs. This way, he can become even stronger. Takuya let out a loud shout as he charged straight for Goda, the iron beam in his hands at his side, his arms wrapped tightly around it. The enemy with weapons is always unpredictable. I thought the other way around. With a crazy smile, he was ready to take the opponent's blows. What's the difference? Kendo Shmendo is all complete nonsense. It's just enough for him to withstand the blow and everything will be fine. Goda was about to grab Takuya, spreading his arms out to capture him. That's it, this will be the end. With wild eyes and a wide grin, he waited for Takuya to finally attack. With a sharp kick, Takuya staggered him with the iron beam hitting him on the body. The guy stopped abruptly, turning around. He stared at Goda with burning eyes. The man couldn't understand what had just happened. Did Takuya strike so quickly? I couldn't figure out how he managed to do it. His face was clearly surprised. Goda gritted his teeth. Takuya was standing behind him, weapons drawn. I thought to myself that I didn't even see the guy swing the pipe. The average kick speed in kendo was only 0.2 seconds. If the blow was delivered by a professional, the speed of the blow could reach as much as 0.1 seconds. Goda looked over his shoulder at him and gritted his teeth. The guy said something with displeasure that he was actually in quite a bit of pain right now. Yusei, who was watching from the side, smiled and clenched his hand into a fist. He couldn't believe that Takuya was actually caught. Yusei smiled and shouted loudly to his friend that he could definitely beat him. Takuya frowned and thought about how anyone else would have fallen with just one punch. He couldn't figure out what was wrong with his body and how he didn't dump it. Takuya looked at Goda and thought that he must have been really serious. Takuya tightened his grip on the weapon. He said that kendo is a variation of swordsmanship. It was originally designed to kill people, and Goda shouldn't have forgotten that. In kendo, you don't just wear armor, but even so, it can't completely protect you. However, during duels, there are cases when the opponent died from a rupture of internal organs due to a direct blow to the body. This is a deadly martial art. Shoko and No. 4 watched the fight in surprise. Shoko smiled and said that at this rate, Takuya would definitely be able to win. Number 4 nodded and said they would hope so. Takuya exhaled. Goda looked at him carefully and watched him. He could see that Takuya was about to attack. Takuya immediately took off, and Goda smiled contentedly, thinking that he knew it, but Takuya was charging at him with a weapon held out in front of him. Goda didn't have time to keep up with his speed, but he thought that Takuya wouldn't be able to catch him anyway. Takuya rushed past, and a stream of blood spurted out of the boy's forehead. The man fell to the ground. Yaosei exclaimed in surprise and couldn't believe that he really failed him. Miguel, meanwhile, had started a shootout with Taiga, and all he had time to do was maneuver between the bushes of plants. They started chasing each other, and Taiga managed to hide under one of the trees for a while. Miguel stopped shooting for a second and said that he was probably starting to lose a bit of his grip on the skill. A worker with broccoli in his mouth exclaimed in surprise at the skill with which this woman dodged all the bullets. From a distance, it was easy to dodge bullets. During the shot, the main thing is to move away from the line of fire. Miguel told the man in front of him that he probably wasn't just lucky, because he pointed a gun at her and she didn't even freeze in fear. This was clearly not an ordinary woman. Miguel smiled as he looked at Taiga from under his hat and asked if she was a case of a killer. Taiga said no, standing behind Miguel and knocking the gun out of his hand. Taiga replied that he was currently working as a cleaner. The watching employee paled even more and thought that she had broken the distance in just an instant. Miguel started to pretend that she had won, but then pulled out another gun, holding it to Taiga's forehead. Miguel smiled and told her that she couldn't dodge point blank, but as soon as he looked down at his hand, he saw that he didn't even have the other gun. In the next second, Taiga twisted Miguel's arms, knocking him to the floor and holding a gun to his head. A loud gunshot rang out, but Taiga didn't shoot him in the head. The shot landed on the floor. Taiga said that he was a cleaner and wouldn't finish him off. Miguel lost. He took a closer look at Taiga and said that he had seen him somewhere before anyway. He recognized the assassin who had destroyed their organization, but he didn't expect it to be a woman. Taiga said that he had spent too much time with them and was about to leave when he heard someone shout. It was Shoko who was asking me to stop. Yusei was lying on the ground. Takuya was covered in blood and unconscious. Goda's face was wild, his eyes bloodshot and ready to pop out of his skull. A blonde man in a blindfold, one of the members of a popular band, rode his bike up to the building where the whole mess was taking place. He looked at the phone and made sure he was in the right place. The smoke of battle cleared. The huge body continued to lie motionless on the ground. The boys tensed, trying to see if they'd really succeeded. I lay there for a year and didn't move. Did he win? Yusei immediately ran towards Takuya, opening his arms wide. Yusei happily shouted out how cool Takuya was. The guy was shyly indignant and told him not to be a liar. Suddenly, Yusei remembered something more important and pushed the boy away unceremoniously, shouting out that he needed to check on Shoko. Yusei ran to the cage and hovered over the girl, looking at her with a serious face and saying that just a little more and the guy will be able to get her out of there. Shoko looked at him shyly, her brows furrowed and her cheeks flushed. Tanabe was sitting next to the other guy, unconscious, and happily exclaimed that he had found the right key. The guy lifted his find into the air with a happy smile, still sitting on the ground. Yusei smiled back, turning to Tanabe and complimenting him on how good he was. Tanabe walked over to Yusei and the girls and started to put the key in the lock, when suddenly number 4 with a pale face shouted at them to turn around and look at what was happening behind them. Yusei and Tanabe immediately jumped up on the spot, slowly turning back. Their faces paled, and they froze in surprise for a second. The huge palm of the year was rushing towards their faces. Before he could react, he grabbed Yaosei's head and slammed him against the wall of the fence with all his strength. Blood immediately began to ooze from the boy's forehead, and Shaoko covered her mouth in horror as she watched. Yusei's eyes rolled back. Shaoko screamed when she saw Yaosei, who was unconscious, slowly rolling down the pillar, leaving a trail of thick red blood behind him. Yusei immediately fell to the ground, unconscious. Takuya clenched his teeth and picked up the iron pipe again, holding it out like a sword in front of him. When I saw him, I darted in his direction. Number 4 watched the scene in disbelief. In her mind, there was only the question of what was wrong with this gorilla. Goda landed in front of Takuya, crouching down and leaning towards the ground. He sat so still for a while. Takuya thought to himself that he should have continued attacking. But in the end, he retreated. Where did his fuse suddenly go? However, as he took a closer look, he realized that no, something wasn't quite right here. It was as if his opponent wasn't even human anymore. Goda's eyes burned, and he frowned as he inhaled and exhaled loudly. He held one hand out to the side, touching the ground with the other. The way he reacted was it just an instinct for self-preservation. Goda looked like he had turned into a mad wild beast. With a loud cry, Goda grabbed the iron beam next to him and tore it off. Takuya stared in horror at what was happening in front of him, his mouth and eyes wide open. The boy immediately frowned and gritted his teeth, wiping the dust off his chin. Just now, Goda had pulled out the iron bar with his bare hands. He was definitely a monster and not a human. Goda slung the iron bar over his shoulders. It was very long, running all the way around his arms and neck, leaving a piece of torn out earth at one end. The rod was too long, which made it impossible for Takuya to calculate the target area. Goda raised the rod above his head and then threw it sharply towards Takuya, which he barely managed to dodge. The bar flew right past his side. Takuya didn't expect him to throw this rod at him as well. Goda immediately ran towards him, and Takuya tried to maneuver just in time. He had to interrupt his stance. Takuya decided that in this case, he should act differently. Takuya grabbed his iron bar and swung it, continuing to run for years. Takuya hit the boy's leg, but the gorilla didn't move. He looked down at the iron bar that had bent where it had hit his leg. Takuya couldn't believe his eyes. Suddenly, taking advantage of Takuya's distraction, Yoda quickly stepped up beside him and wrapped his huge hands around his head. Takuya looked up at Goda, but Goda immediately squeezed his head with all his strength. Takuya immediately fell to the ground, blood spurting from his mouth. However, the guy didn't have time to fall to the ground when Goda grabbed him by the hair. Holding his head tightly, I slammed my knee into his face. He continued to beat up Takuya severely. The voice in Goda's head spoke. He was a little surprised to see Takuya in front of him. He realized that if he didn't stop now, he would simply kill him. Takuya was lying unconscious, covered in blood. His entire face and chest were covered in drops of blood. I saw him covered in blood. He shifted his gaze, and through the red haze, he saw Yaosei, who was also lying unconscious on the floor. Goda followed his gaze to the girls, who were staring in horror at the scene in front of them. Number 4 opened her mouth and Shoko covered it with her hands, her eyes wide. I couldn't think straight. He remembered that this had happened before, all because of his worthless father. His father was the head of the foreign mafia department in Japan. He often beat his mother, and he also often got hurt. Because I didn't get enough points on the test, or because I just sat and watched TV because I was walking too loudly. He remembered seeing a huge figure appear in front of him when he got home from school. The man was looking at him and clenching his fists tightly. It wasn't hard for his father to find a suitable reason. He beat him up every day, and so his body became stronger. The father raised a huge fist over the little boy, and then he himself began to beat others. When Gota started high school, his father, as usual, decided to beat him up. However, this time it was different. Gota lay on the floor with a bruised forehead as the huge man stood over him, his hands clenched into fists. There was a pool of blood under the guy. He was unconscious, bleeding profusely, and should have died. However, he suddenly woke up. Gota's eyes were bloodshot. The next thing he knew, he was standing over his father, who was lying over him in a pool of blood. He could see his own reflection in the pool of blood that was spreading under the man's head. It took me a moment to realize that he must have done it. In the next moment, the doctors were already taking my father away. He was called to the police station and sat at a desk in front of a policeman in a small office, who continued to question him. They attributed to him all sorts of extenuating circumstances. He spent his entire high school career in a temporary detention center for juvenile delinquents. It was a rewarding experience. If you want to survive, you must make everyone bow down to your incredible strength. The absolute rule of this disgusting world. Only then did he realize that he was finally free. Suddenly, a voice snapped him out of his thoughts and memories. The voice screamed it got it to stop, because otherwise he would kill him. Gota opened his bleary eyes and saw Takuya lying in blood in front of him. He was holding the boy by the throat. Gota scratched the back of his head, his hands covered in blood up to the elbows. He closed his eyes and thought that he had lost control of himself again. Suddenly there was the sound of footsteps. Gota immediately reacted to him and spun around, asking who was there. Taiga was standing in the doorway. Gota immediately smiled and let go of Takuya, causing him to fall flat on the floor. Gota happily told Taiga that out of everyone who came to this hole, she was the best. He added that he initially thought that he would treat her gently so as not to break her. However, now he was afraid that he wanted to break it with just one blow. Gota started to walk closer, a crazy smile on his face. With a cry that he couldn't take it anymore, the boy charged straight for Taiga, intending to grab him with his giant hands. Taiga let out a deep breath and immediately took a stance, his eyes lighting up with a bright flame. Gota immediately felt threatened and slowed down with a surprised face. Gota frowned and carefully examined Taiga. He realized that this girl was definitely not a joke after all. He even wondered if he could actually beat her at all. Therefore, if so, Gota crouched down and clenched his hands into huge fists, slamming them to the floor. He shouted loudly and started jumping towards Taiga like a gorilla. Taiga was surprised to think that Gota was approaching him not on her feet, but on four limbs. He managed to react and dodge the man who was rushing towards him, and he slammed into the wall, knocking it right through. Taiga wondered what those movements were all about and that he was moving like he was some kind of rabid animal, and he had never fought a wild beast before. Gota turned his burning gaze on Taiga and once again rushed straight towards him. Taiga knew that if he was captured by him, he would definitely end up dead because the guy in front of him was clearly pretty strong. Attacks also had to be avoided, as blocking them was clearly not an option. Gota swung at Taiga, but Taiga once again dodged the huge fist in time. Gota continued to attack him, and the guy had to block the kick to avoid it hitting him right in the face. This was the first time he had done this in his entire career. Before, when he had fought humans, he had never lost. Gota continued to run around him like a crazy beast, shouting out various sounds. Taiga didn't lose to an assassin like himself, a bodyguard, a thug, or a military man. No one. The experience of all these battles will remain in his body forever. Taiga was able to avoid someone else's punch by hitting him back. A red spot appeared on the man's forehead, but he continued to smile crazily. Gota once again began to run around him like an animal, attacking Taiga from different directions. That was why, no matter who Taiga had encountered before, he would immediately know at a glance how much he needed to win. He shot past the man, grabbing another beam. He easily bent it and tore it out of the ground, throwing it straight towards Taiga. The man managed to dodge in time. Gota ran to the cage and started climbing up it. Despite all his experience, there was no way Taiga could accurately predict the man's movements. After climbing to the top of the box, Gota swung on one of the iron loops that held the structure and jumped down. Gota started flying towards Taiga with an enraged shout. At that moment, the man realized that defeating him would definitely not be as easy as he thought. Taiga jumped back in time. The girls looked on in surprise. Tanabe suddenly opened the door for them and shouted loudly to the girls to get out of here immediately. However, the guys did not have time to react exactly in time. Goda was already looming over them, right at the entrance where Shoko and Tanabe were standing. They looked up and saw the man's crazy smile. At the same time, Goda flew down on top of them, and Taiga quickly moved towards them, roughly pushing Shoko and the other guys away so that she immediately fell to the ground, ending up in the place where Goda was currently flying. The guy fell to the ground, and there was a huge sound of impact on a hard surface. The boys screamed in horror. The smoke made it difficult for them to see exactly what had happened. Tanabe, Shoko, and number 4 shifted their gaze to where Taiga and I should be. Goda was holding Taiga by the throat, blood dripping from Goda's forehead, but he didn't seem to care at all. He was smiling, his eyes bright with the light of madness. Goda only said briefly that the girl had finally fallen into his hands. 10 seconds. This is exactly how long, according to calculations, the Taiga has left to live. He was gripping his throat tightly with his huge hand. The year began a slow countdown. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Suddenly, Taiga's face turned pale, his eyes rolled up behind his lids, and his head fell limply on his chest. Goda grinned. All he could think about was that he had finally won. Abruptly, however, his thoughts were interrupted. Taiga grabbed the hand that was holding him tightly. Goda's eyes widened in disbelief. Taiga swung his legs up and wrapped his forelimbs around him, hanging onto his arm like a koala in a tree. Taiga leaned down and wrapped one arm around Goda's leg, causing him to roll over and knock the man to the ground. He hit his head on the floor and screamed loudly. Now their position was reversed, and Taiga was sitting on top of him, gripping his arm with his legs wrapped around him as he lay on his back on the ground. Goda's eyes widened in horror, unable to believe how things had turned out. It was impossible, because Taiga was definitely going to lose consciousness, so how was he able to move? Goda stared at him, dumbfounded. He remembered flying towards Taiga with the intention of grabbing him by the throat. Had he taken a deep breath just before Goda grabbed him? Goda shouted out in disgust that even in this case, it all seemed like some kind of nonsense. What capacity do you need to have lungs to be able to crank something like this? Taiga was silent. A long time ago, one of his training sessions took place underwater. He had to hide from the sharks underwater for a full 20 minutes. The young Taiga swam lower and lower on the blue ocean, sinking to the level of the rocks. He hid behind them as a pack of sharks swam past, holding an iron harpoon. Goda chuckled at his words. He said that now he only wants to break Taiga even more. He swung his huge fist, intending to hit the exposed part of the guy, but Taiga managed to jump out of the way in time and release him from his grip. Taiga looked at the hole in the ground in surprise. This blow was even stronger than the last time. Goda bent down to the ground with his fist stuck in it. Taiga knew that if he got caught again, he would definitely never let him go again. Goda glanced over his shoulder at him, and in the next second, he was moving quickly in his direction. He started moving again, like a gorilla. He was rushing towards the Taiga, still moving on all fours. Goda swung his fist, intending to strike, but Taiga blocked it. Taiga didn't immediately understand what had happened. The force of the blow sent him flying. The boys shouted out his name in horror, and number 4 said with a surprised face that it was obviously very painful. Taiga leaned against the wall that he had just been thrown into. Unsurpassed power. He thought that it was as if he was actually fighting a real wild beast. The car immediately began to run toward him again. Taiga realized that there was no other choice, and he would have to resort to a special technique. He pulled his arm out of the way and strained hard, the veins poking out through the skin on his arm, and there was a crunching sound. He decided to cheat the year. Taiga pretended to hit him, causing him to immediately defend himself, but Taiga cupped both hands and ducked under the guy. He was behind him and didn't have time to react, just opened his eyes in surprise, and Taiga took advantage of this and grabbed Yer by the head, blocking his throat. He began to choke him, and he became a little weak. Taiga thought about how he also managed to talk and scold him with various words, because he had often used this technique to kill people before. A wild animal always has a good sense of smell, because it is driven by instincts. Goda's mouth opened wide, and his eyes began to roll back behind his lids. It's easy to distract the animals with a loud sound like a pop, which is what Taiga did when he cupped his hands together. He would never have thought that he could use the knowledge of fighting an animal in a fight with a human. However, no matter what, it will always open the way to victory. 10 years ago, the young Taiga was standing in front of an older man who was sitting in a lotus position, leaning against a tree. Both of them were somewhere deep in the forest. The older man crossed his arms and told him that he had been teaching Taiga the art of killing for quite some time, and that was why he thought it was time for them to move on to the next level. Taiga was twirling a hunting knife in his hand when he grabbed it by the handle after the man's words and asked him what this time was and what the next step was. The man closed his eyes and said that all this time, he had only taught him how to kill an ordinary person. The snake was behind the old man's back, but at the same time, the knife that Taiga had been holding flew at the animal. The old man continued and added that in the past, Taiga only learned to kill people who were his size or slightly smaller. Taiga confirmed his words and asked what was next. At the same time, there was a commotion behind the boy. He looked back and saw a huge bear that was 2 or 3 times his size in front of him. The animal growled savagely. The old man said that now Taiga would learn to kill those who were much bigger than himself. Killing the bear wasn't easy. You need to grab his neck from the back so he can't reach you with his paws. Taiga listened carefully to what the old man was saying, and then it was necessary to strangle and not let go. Taiga was applying the same knowledge to Goda right now, grabbing him by the neck as he helplessly tried to do something. No matter how big or strong the creature is, as soon as the blood flow to the brain weakens, it will immediately lose consciousness. Therefore, if you don't let him go, then Taiga will already have the victory in his pocket. He continued to hold on to Goda's neck, watching him closely. However, all of a sudden, Goda grabbed him by the hands that were holding the boy. Goda sent him flying, falling on his back, causing Taiga to fall after him and hit his head on the ground. Taiga immediately bounced a good distance away from him. He rubbed his bruised head. Taiga thought about how the guy's neck muscles were too strong, which was why he couldn't finish what he started in the end. To kill the bear then, he used a Kevlar cord. Without it, he definitely wouldn't be able to strangle this monster. Goda rubbed his temple, his eyes still shining fiercely with a bright light. Taiga said that he definitely must have some weakness, and Goda immediately responded angrily that it was impossible and that he definitely couldn't have any weaknesses. Suddenly, the man's attention was distracted by Yusei's voice, and together with the blonde, they started to slowly recover and tremble. And Yusei told Taiga that Goda was not someone who could be defeated, and that they should take Shoko and run away from here. Shoko looked at the battered Yusei in shock, but Taiga didn't listen to him. It wasn't over yet, and there was still a chance that he could win. Taiga rushed straight at him. There is always a weak spot in the human body, even if the body itself was made of steel, which was the legs. Taiga ran up to him when he was close enough and threw a punch at the opponent's legs. However, Goda barely moved. The blonde guy said that he was incredibly stupid, and Yusei shouted that he was definitely not fooled by a simple low kick. Goda clenched his fists, hovering over the ground. He told them that they were all doing the same stupid thing. Both Akikawa and Jajima, although the idea was good, but this will definitely not go away with the body of the year. Goda grinned, but suddenly fell to his knees. Taiga was standing behind him. He told him that he thought Goda was a special opponent, but in the end, he had wasted so much effort to find another way. Taiga grinned as he towered over Goda, who was on his knees. Taiga summed it up and said that in the end, it turned out that Goda was still an ordinary person. Goda stared at him with burning eyes. He didn't understand how it had even happened. How did Taiga break through his steel body? The boys stared in shock at the situation in front of them. Seriously, they'd hit him in the legs so many times and none of them had worked. Goda was on all fours, leaning on the ground, and Taiga said that he was probably just lucky. Goda clenched his teeth in anger and shouted out that Taiga was literally telling him that he had accidentally broken his leg. Taiga didn't say anything for a while, and then turned to the kids and asked them what they thought they had to do to break through the iron wall. Takuya and Yusei looked at him blankly, not understanding the meaning of the question. Takuya replied that there was no other choice but to beat the wall until it broke. Taiga nodded and said that yes, it is. Beat it until it breaks. He clenched his hand into a fist and gave the boys a dark look. Hit again and again, that was his correct answer. Goda grabbed his knee, pulling it closer to him. Any metal will eventually break if you continue to work on it over and over again. And Taiga was able to break him with one punch because they guys set the stage for that with their punches. Taiga looked in their direction, looking at them carefully. He thanked them. Takuya gritted his teeth, saying that it just sounded like nonsense. Even if you had a stick of some sort, the iron wall couldn't be broken through by a hail of blows. Yusei chimed in and shouted Taiga, which was obviously just something wrong with his body. He kicked him with all his might, but he didn't even move, and Yusei felt at that moment like he had kicked a lamppost, and it was incredibly painful. Taiga asked if they could stand up already. Takuya and Yusei looked at the man. He came closer to them and said that in that case they could move out. However, a voice interrupted them and asked where they were going, as if someone would let them go. A crowd of people in green uniforms came in behind the ear. One of the men leaned over him and asked if he was okay, to which Goda, with a furious face and burning eyes, told them to give up on him and immediately take care of the guys in front of them. Taiga thought that it was really bad. He looked back at Takuya and Yusei. First a fight with a real beast, and now this. A huge crowd surrounded them, drawing them into a circle. Would these two be strong enough to help him? However, it would be better if they ran away altogether. Taiga took up a stance, his face grim. We'll have to do everything we can to stop them. Shoko swallowed hard. The girl took up a stance and asked number 4 if she could fight. Number 4 smiled and asked what kind of recklessness she had in mind and how they could fight such a huge crowd. Shoko hesitantly held out her hand. She stood on alert and thought that this time, it really looked like they were going to end. The crowd rushed towards Taiga and the boys with a loud roar, but sudden blows from the other side interrupted their attention and forced them to stop. They looked around and one of the guys of the year met the wheel of a motorcycle. A guy in a school uniform and helmet flew in at high speed and noisily, riding on top of a huge motorcycle. Everyone inside looked at him in surprise. The bike spun around and stopped. The stranger pointed his finger at the passageway and Taiga followed the direction of his gaze. Apparently, this person had opened up an escape route for them. Shoko looked around and asked where the other girls were. Tanabe immediately grinned and pointed a finger at himself, telling them not to worry, because while Goda was waving his fists around, he managed to lead everyone else to safety. The guy was immediately praised for his resourcefulness. Taiga nodded and said that in that case, there was no need for them to stay here any longer. He loudly ordered everyone to run for the exit, and the crowd of kids moved to retreat while the stranger in the helmet circled on a motorcycle and distracted the rest of the opponents. After a while, the whole crowd was on the street. Everyone was trying to catch their breath, coming to their senses. Taiga asked if all the guys were gathered here. A creaking wheel caught their attention. The motorcycle stopped nearby, and when Taiga noticed the guy on it, he thanked the stranger for saving them, but he was curious to find out who exactly it was. The stranger grabbed the helmet on his head and took it off, showing off his face. It turned out to be a student of Kaiose High School, 2nd grade in Kisaragi-shin. Shauko let out a surprised cry when she saw Shin standing in front of her. Shin silently pointed a finger in the direction of number 4. The girl didn't say anything, but then let out a loud sigh. Shin said that he just came to save his little sister. The girl crossed her arms in displeasure and looked away, blushing a little. People were surprised that she was his younger sister. Number 4 smiled awkwardly and said that she really hadn't introduced herself yet, and her real name was Kisaragi Misei. Shoko exclaimed in surprise. Shin made some incomprehensible movements without saying a word, which only Misa understood. Misa explained exactly what he said with these signs and translated it as "I've already called the police, you can safely go home." The boys looked at her with a dejected expression. Was she some kind of translator? Misa immediately said that since this was the case, they would be the first to go home. The girl jumped into the backseat of her brother's motorcycle and put on a helmet, waving goodbye to the other guys. Shoko was surprised to say that she met Kisaragi's younger sister in such a strange place, and her brother was hitting bandits on a motorcycle. Yusei put his arm around Takuya's shoulders and happily shouted that everything was fine, that everything was ending well, and most importantly that everyone was alive and well. Tanabe smiled at his words, and the other guys looked at him uncertainly. However, everyone confirmed that yes, he was right. Meanwhile, Misa and Shin were racing down the road. Misa spoke up and told her brother that the person he had asked her to study wasn't there. Shin glanced at her, then looked back at the road and calmly replied that in that case, it was a pity, of course, but there was no need to take such a big risk. Misa looked away awkwardly and mumbled something uncertainly, and Shin stopped at a traffic light and turned back to his sister, telling her not to tell him that she just wanted to eat free food in enemy territory. Misa blushed a little and said with displeasure that the food was too delicious. Shin didn't say anything at first, but then he told her that she was stupid and it would be better to take care of herself at least a little. Misa grumbled that it should be so. Miguel, meanwhile, was standing in front of the growing plants on the plantation. He drained the alcohol from the can directly onto the plant and said that from now on, the plan was over, and so was this Midorikikai branch. Miguel was about to walk away, throwing the empty bottle of alcohol over his shoulder and smashing it to smithereens. He snatched a match from his pocket and lit one. Alex had been instrumental in creating Midorikikai, but now it was all over. After all, he was just the small-time upstart that he ended up being. Miguel lit one match, looked at it carefully, and then tossed it aside. The fire immediately broke out behind him. Miguel told himself that he had expected a lot from him, but now he would have to go on his own way. Miguel stopped abruptly, looking down at the floor. A half-bitten piece of broccoli lay on the floor. He thought for a while, then crushed the vegetable under his foot. Panic began to engulf the entire building, and the fire began to spread rapidly across its entire area. There were shouts that a fire had started and they needed to get out of here right away. Doda was lying on the ground. The fire was already close enough to him. The commotion caused his eyes to open slightly. He turned his gaze to the fire and was surprised that the flames were so strong. Koda tried to get up, but he only managed to sit down and put his elbows on the floor. He laughed bitterly and said that in this situation he couldn't even move again. Behind him, Koda could hear the frantic shouts that they needed to get out of here faster. It was clear that no one was going to help him at all. I thought it was funny. All his life, he had thought that he was the strongest person in this world. No matter what happened, he never admitted his weaknesses. How wrong he was. Doda looked up, surrounded by a huge amount of fire. He remembered the image of Takuya. He told himself ironically that he never would have thought that at the end of his life he would meet the woman he would fall in love with. He had once vowed to live his life without regrets, and now he couldn't believe that he would end up regretting it. Doda looked up to God and said it was too mean. After which, he lowered his head and chuckled, thinking that this must have been the karma that many people were talking about. The building began to collapse, covering everything with rubble. Years later, Alex died. Several days had passed since the Midorikikai raid. Lunch break. Takuya appeared at the entrance to the classroom. He had a lot of band-aids on his face, but overall he looked good. He walked into the classroom and said hello. Tanabe was standing next to Yusei's desk and he, who was also covered in band-aids and had a bandaged head, asked the guy if he was skipping first class, and the guy said no. Takuya took a bun out of the bag and started eating it, adding that he wasn't going to skip class, but he had a fight with the younger kids. Yusei looked at him questioningly. Takuya remembered entering the building, but there were several people blocking the way. Several men were standing in front of him alone. As it turned out, these were the remnants of Midorikikai. In the end, Takuya had to teach them all a good lesson. Takuya walked past the battered boys who were lying on top of each other. Yusei lowered his head guiltily and apologized for the fact that now none of the guys would have a peaceful life because of him. The voice above Yusei's head told him not to apologize, because those guys were nothing after all. Tanabe laughed as he stood next to them and added that Midorikikai was just an empty phrase now, and so as long as they were together, they had nothing to fear. Yusei looked at the boys in surprise, not expecting such words. The guys added, looking at him, that after all, they got out of there alive, after all. Yusei stared at them, his eyes wide with surprise. He pursed his lips and lowered his head, thanking them for their words. Takuya and Tanabe both smiled. Takuya sat down next to the guy and asked, I wonder what kind of beautiful girl Tanabe brought. The one that was able to fill up the year, cool and beautiful. Yusei asked him if he had fallen in love at first sight, and Takuya said if he didn't love older people. Yusei exclaimed at his question, then blushed deeply and hesitated a bit. Tanabe interrupted him and asked them what they were planning to do, and maybe they should go to karaoke or something. Yaosei apologized loudly and scratched his cheek with the same red face, saying that he actually had slightly different plans. The boys looked at him questioningly, but Yusei didn't say anything and immediately turned away from them. Yusei glanced back at Shoko, who was standing in the crowd of her friends, and the girl turned back. Their eyes met, and Shoko immediately blushed and looked away, pretending that nothing had happened. Yusei smiled lovingly, and the guys on his side looked grim. They turned sharply to him and began jokingly saying that he was a scoundrel and already managed to arrange his personal life. With a red face, Yaosei immediately raised his hands as if he had nothing to do with it. Tanabe grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and started loudly asking him if he should definitely go on a date. Yusei tried to calm him down, while Shoko was trembling on the side at how embarrassed she was by the boy's words. Yusei scratched his head awkwardly and said with the same red face that he just wanted to see Shoko home, that's all. After lessons, Shoko and Yusei walked through the center of the city. Everywhere there were tall buildings and various kinds of signs that invited them to go inside. Yusei turned to the girl and asked if her leg was okay, and Shoko looked at him questioningly. The guy added that she missed the club's classes. One of Shoko's legs was wrapped in a bandage. The girl smiled and said that the leg was fine and it was very minor injuries, if you understand that they escaped from the Midorikikai lair. Of course, she couldn't run fast yet, but that's okay, the girl planned to recover in time for the competition. Yusei smiled and said that he was glad to hear it. Shoko turned the topic to him and asked him how he felt, because he was very seriously beaten up, which caused Yusei to look away. He smiled innocently, blushing a little, and said that it wasn't so bad, but in fact it felt like his whole body was falling apart. Shoko suddenly stopped and exclaimed when she saw something. They stopped at the entrance to the center. With a smile on her face, Shoko turned to Yusei and asked if he would like to go there, since they hadn't played together in a long time. Yaosei looked at her in silence for a moment, then smiled and said that it was fine, so be it. They were in the center, and Yusei was standing next to a toy vending machine. He almost managed to pull out the teddy bear, but the device at the very last moment unclenched and dropped the prize back. Yusei held his head in confusion while Shoko laughed. After a while, they were standing in the photo booth. Shoko grabbed the guy's arm, causing him to blush deeply, looking at her awkwardly while Shoko stared straight into the camera. She made a peace sign and told him to smile, and Yaosei awkwardly agreed. Later, they sat in the food court and ate ice cream. Shoko had a pink cup, and Yusei had a sundae cup. The girl reached for his cup with her small spoon and asked if she could try it, after which she offered him her ice cream, handing him her cup with a smile on her face. Yaosei immediately blushed deeply and became nervous, saying that it was better for him to refuse, which made Shoko laugh and retreat anyway. Yusei continued to happily eat his ice cream. Shoko looked down and blushed as she continued to eat her ice cream with the guy. They followed her to the store. The boys were walking between the shelves, huddled together because it was quite cramped inside. Shoko's attention was drawn to a strange toy that looked like a wolf. She grabbed it and started showing it off to Yaosei with glowing eyes, talking about how cute it was, while the boy awkwardly looked at the toy and wondered if it was really true. She turned to the other shelves and asked the guy if he would buy her something in her hands while saying that it was cheap here, and Yusei turned to her and saw a soccer ball in the girl's hands. The guy seemed to think about something, looked down at the floor and agreed with her that he would buy it, but it was really cheap. The children found themselves on the playground, where Yusei was kicking a new soccer ball. Shoko was standing nearby and said with a smile that the guy was good after all, and he hesitantly replied that he probably was. Shoko sat down on the bench, closing her eyes and saying that it had been a long time since they had walked together like this. Yusei replied that they hadn't spoken much at all since he left the soccer club. Shoko looked up at the guy as he continued to kick the ball and asked why he left, and although she didn't know exactly if the guy wanted to talk about it, Yusei stopped hitting the ball and said that he wasn't really sure if he wanted to talk about it now or not, even if it sounded like an excuse. Shoko was a little annoyed when she insisted that he tell her because Yusei used to love football so much. Not far from them, two boys were playing in the playground, and they both noticed them. Yusei exhaled and sat down next to Shoko. He bent over the ground with his head down and said hesitantly that it was actually because of the coach. Shoko clarified that his coach was supposed to be teacher Ikuhara, and Yusei confirmed her words by repeating his name to himself. Yaosei rubbed his palms together and continued, saying that the teacher was the coach of the football club and was also very popular with women. He was put in charge because he himself said that he had the necessary knowledge to do this. Yusei frowned, clenching his hands into fists. But all the knowledge of teachers and technicians has been outdated for a long time. Because of this, the team constantly went all tired and shabby, and for those who couldn't keep up with his frenzied pace of training, he didn't skimp on insults either. Yusei clenched his jaw, clenching his hand into a fist. The atmosphere was just awful. Shoko looked at the guy in shock, not believing such words. She asked if Ikuhara was really that ugly, and that she would definitely never have guessed it. Yusei exhaled and said that the teacher was only a darling on the outside, and you wouldn't know that unless you personally went to his class. And it was because of this whole situation that the guy decided to start practicing on his own. However, it is obvious that not all team members were satisfied with this situation. Everyone began to look at him with disgust, and apparently for them it looked as if he just decided to run away. Yusei summed it up and said that this is how it really happened. Yaosei drooped and Shoko said that she had said so many terrible things to him and that she was very sorry, but the guy waved it off and said that it was okay and that she should also forgive him. And if he hadn't started hanging out with the bad guys, Shoko wouldn't have gotten into trouble, and in fact, it was all his fault. Shoko said quietly that she was actually glad that the guy had told her the truth about why he left the soccer club, and Yusei called out and asked her what she even cared. Shoko was outraged in response and said that they were actually childhood friends, and the guy replied that this had nothing to do with it at all. After a few seconds, both of them calmed down and stood in front of each other, trembling a little and blushing. Yaosei awkwardly looked away and said that he should have listened to the girl in the first place and stopped hanging out with the bad guys, and that he was really sorry for dragging her into all this. Suddenly, Yusei abruptly approached the girl, blushing deeply and still trembling with fear and excitement, and added that he only understood now. Shoko looked at him questioningly. He hesitated, and the girl looked at him expectantly. Just as he plucked up the courage to say what was on his mind, a soccer ball flew straight at his head from the direction of the playground where the children were playing. Yaosei immediately glared at them, and the younger kids started shouting apologies and asking them to give them the ball. Yaosei immediately grabbed the ball and violently threw it in their direction. The ball rolled up to the guys and they thanked him with a smile, and the guy shouted after them that they should not interfere with them again. Shoko immediately burst out laughing and told the guy that he was acting like he was a junior, which made Yusei blush and start denying it and saying that it wasn't like that at all. The girl smiled in the evening sun and said that she was actually glad that everything had ended well, and if he wanted to, they could go out again sometime. Yusei looked at her carefully and then smiled back radiantly and said that of course. They got up from the bench and started walking along the evening road when Yusei asked her if she knew what kind of strong lady had saved them, and the girl replied with a nervous smile that she was just a friend of his acquaintance. A young girl was sitting at a work desk, her brown hair partially pinned up in a ponytail. Ashino was asked to distract herself for a moment, and the girl turned at the sound of the voice, seeing Ikuhara in front of her and asking what was the matter. A tall man stood in front of her. It was Ikuhara, Tsujino's soccer club coach. He smiled and said that one of his former students was involved in a fire, and she must have heard about it. Ashino immediately reacted to his words. She hesitated uncomfortably and looked away, crumpling her skirt under her hands. The man continued with a smile that he would say it straight away and that he was going to offer everyone involved to drop out of school tomorrow. Ashino immediately jumped up. All of them for deduction. Shoko, Yusei, Takuya, Taneb. Can all of them be expunged? Ashino was immediately indignant at his words, causing her to slow down a bit. She jumped up from her chair and said that she would have to wait for the students to explain all the details of the case first. She shook a little and hesitantly told him to wait and give her some more time. Ikuhara looked at her grimly and smiled that since she was asking for it, then so be it. The man turned away, preparing to leave the office, and added that it was a complete waste of time anyway. Ashino sat at the table with her arms crossed and her head resting on them. She was thinking about Takuya and the other guys. All of them were very close friends with those who died in that fire, especially with Goda. Therefore, the fact that they were all at the scene looked extremely suspicious. Suddenly, the woman's thoughts were interrupted by Shouko, who knocked on the door and apologized for the intrusion. Ashino immediately turned her head in her direction and asked her to enter. Shouko bowed as she walked over to the table. Ashino invited her to sit in the chair opposite. Ashino thought to herself that she also got the information that Heroes was at that place. And what would a student like her ever forget in a place like this? Ashino frowned slightly and became gloomy with thoughts. She had to find out everything, otherwise everything could end badly. The teacher turned to Shouko and asked if she could ask her about the fire, and Shouko nodded approvingly. Ashino immediately apologized and asked if it was true that Shouko was also there with the others. The girl immediately trembled and didn't immediately respond. Clenching her fists in her lap and looking away, she replied that yes, it was true. Ashino hesitantly asked why and what she was doing there. Shouko looked down and said that it was because of Yase, and that she was afraid that he had been dragged into some dangerous business and that she was worried about him. The girl immediately blushed, unsure of what to say, and added that he was just a childhood friend of hers. Ashino pursed her lips and nodded, telling her that she fully understood Shoko's feelings, but it was too dangerous to go there alone. Shouko immediately replied with a sad face that she was just asking someone for help, but she immediately jumped up on the spot, not sure if it was okay to say that. Ashino tried to clarify who she was talking about, and Shouko immediately began to deny it and say that it wasn't really that important. Shouko looked down uncertainly, and Ashino frowned. It occurred to her who she might be talking about. After a while, the woman let go of the girl and met Taiga on the stairs, calling out to him and asking if the man had a minute of time. Taiga nodded and asked her if she wanted to talk. A couple of minutes later, they were sitting across from each other at a small table. They each had a cup of green tea. Ashino decided to start with a question right away and directly asked if he had dragged Shouko to that terribly dangerous den of bandits and drug addicts. The man immediately calmly replied that yes, it was him, but what's the matter? Ashino immediately frowned and clutched her head, tiredly saying that she would like to hear the reason why this was done on his part. She added that she was sure that the guy was going to go alone, and why did he suddenly allow the girl to follow him? Taiga seriously replied that it was because Shouko was extremely determined, and that he had taught her basic self-defense and that was why he had brought her along. The girl, unlike the man, looked a little depressed and dejected. Ashino looked down and asked the guy if he knew exactly what this place was. The girl slammed her hands on the table and immediately jumped up from her seat, with a furious face saying that even so, the man still dragged a student of the school with him. Taiga replied that she was ready, so what was the big deal? Ashino started up and continued to talk indignantly about how even if she was determined, he still had to stop her and what to do in the event that something happened to her. The man calmly replied that she was not injured in any case. Ashino stared at him, then lowered her head, leaning her hands on the table and said that since everything worked out well, then there are no problems, and that their student had actually died in that fire. Taiga said nothing. He continued to stare at the girl, his eyes unreadable. Ashino looked at him closely and asked if he didn't feel anything at all. And did he have no heart at all? Noticing how the man's expression darkened, the girl immediately apologized and added that she clearly shouldn't have said that. Ashino looked down and said that it was her own fault, and what kind of homeroom teacher would she be if the kids in the class didn't trust her? After all, Shouko ended up going to him for help, not her, and all because she was weak, plus she blamed him. The girl half rose from the table and excused herself. Taiga looked away and said that he didn't need to. Ashino stood up and bowed, adding to her words that from now on, she would do everything she could to prove that her students could rely on her. The girl smiled awkwardly and said it was time for her to go, walking out the door and closing it behind her. Taiga looked at her as she left, and then looked at the tea. He stared intently at the green tea mug. Taiga pondered her words about her heart. Then he stood up and summed up the fact that his heart had never been useful to him before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, pressing the call button. On the other end of the line, a man's voice came out and said annoyingly that Taiga hadn't called him in a long time. The man asked what was the matter. Taiga asked the person on the phone if he could come to the sauna today. The man was surprised to say that it was quite rare and whether Taiga had any problems, and the guy replied that it could be said that these problems were related to relationships at work. The man replied that Taiga could come and he would warn someone, and the guy thanked him and hung up. After some time, the guy was already in the sauna. Huge fumes of smoke emanated from the mischievous tree. The men were sitting on the wooden stairs in the sauna and warming up the place. The other patrons could sense even outside the door that the heat in the room was felt even by them. The man who was sitting next to Taiga told him that he didn't change at all and that his body was still in perfect shape. Taiga looked at the man with the sprouting blonde hair and said that his master, on the contrary, had changed a lot and that every time he met him it was like he was becoming a different person. The master chuckled and said that it was enough for him to look into his eyes and see the whole truth, namely the old man who taught young Taiga a long time ago. Taiga, however, turned away and said that he would do without making eye contact, which made the master smile awkwardly. He asked Taiga what he wanted to talk to him about in the end, and if it was because he wanted to know the latest trends in homicide. Taiga, with a serious face, told the master to tell him about the heart. The master opened his eyes in surprise and asked again what he meant. Taiga explained that in order to successfully complete the task, it was necessary to establish a friendly relationship with one person. But now he had a feeling that he might lose that person's trust in him, and that she said that he didn't have a heart. The master smiled and said that now it was clear what was going on, and the guy probably just said some offensive things. Taiga asked her what she meant by that and how he could get her trust back. The master chuckled and said with a smile on his face that he never would have thought that the day would come when he would have to advise the guy on such matters, and added that so be it, let him tell all the details already. The man said that he understood the whole situation and could at least say that Taiga was not to blame, and that it was the master's fault because it was he who brought him up in this way. He had killed all the emotions in him, trained him to be a perfect and cold-blooded killer, imprinted 100 ways of killing in his head. That was his upbringing. Taiga looked at him and asked if it was possible that he really didn't have a heart at all. However, the master shook his head and said that no, and that there are no people in the world who have absolutely no heart, and it's just that he had almost zero experience with ordinary people. The master said that first he would put everything on the shelf so that he would understand exactly. His mistake wasn't that he took Shoko with him, but that he didn't know how to deal with Ami, who was angry with him because of this, and it was at this point that he failed. The master smiled, holding up a finger. Each person has their own views on life and their own opinion, and it was very important to understand the other person's views and adapt to them. Taiga pondered over his words and wondered what he meant by fitting in with a human and clarified if that meant he should have apologized to her first. The master confirmed and praised the guy, telling him that he is very quick to grasp. Taiga stood up and said with a serious face that he understood everything, and then he should contact her right away. At the same time, he turned to the master and asked if he already wanted to give up and get out of the sauna first. The master immediately frowned and told him to shut up and that he definitely wouldn't lose to him. The next day, Ashina walked down the hall, holding her dad close. She thought about how she had talked to Takuya, Shoko, and the others, and without a doubt, the beauty who had saved them was Takuya. The girl stopped in front of the staff room and called out to teacher Ikuhara with a serious face. She went inside and the man turned around at the sight of the girl, smiling and asking her if she had talked to the students. Ikuhara was already smiling triumphantly at the sight of the crestfallen teacher and thinking that he was still saying that it was a waste of time and that he already knew everything beforehand from a reliable source. And no matter what she said, the little scoundrels would still get what they deserved. Although if she wanted to cover up the growing scandal involving her students, he might change his mind. Ikuhara gave Hoshino a dirty look, looking her up and down with a dirty smile. Hoshino awkwardly averted her gaze and began to squirm, telling the man not to tell the other teachers, and that only Ikuhara should know about it. The girl added that she would be frank. Ikuhara immediately smiled happily, his mouth hanging open and his eyes bulging. She said that a beautiful woman with long hair was seen in that place. She was the one who dragged Shoko in, and she was the one who got Takuya and the other guys involved, and that she was actually the girl. Ikuhara looked at her dumbfounded, not immediately believing what she had just said. Hoshino immediately bowed guiltily and apologized, saying that she was sorry that she didn't say it sooner and that it was all her fault. Ikuhara looked at her with a puzzled expression and asked if she meant that it wasn't their fault. The girl continued to stand with her head bowed and nodded, saying that yes, it was true and they had nothing to do with it. Ikuhara chuckled nervously and walked over to his desk, telling her that saying such things was rather unexpected. Hoshino immediately raised her head and loudly stated that if he thought she was lying, Ikuhara could ask her students. There was another girl with Shoko, and any of the contestants would tell him that. She was bullied at school. She remembered the crowd of students surrounding her and kicking her with their feet and hands. All she could do was cover her head. The next moment, when the beating stopped, she slowly opened her eyes. She saw Taiga, who shielded her and put his hands out in front of him. Hoshino looked up, surprised at the sight. One of the kids shouted Taiga out of the way, and in the next second, they were shouting and running at him in a crowd. People started beating and kicking him while Hoshino watched in horror from the side, covering her mouth with her hands. Taiga was lying flat on the ground, and when the students calmed down, they finally threw out the fact that he had had enough for today, and that tomorrow it would be better if he didn't show up at all. As soon as they left, Hoshino jumped down and ran to Taiga, and he asked her if she was okay. The girl put her hand over her mouth and said she was fine, but you couldn't say that about him. Taiga immediately stood up calmly and said that since this was the case, he could go home safely. Hoshino caught up with him and asked him to stop, grabbing his arm. She looked at him carefully and asked the guy why he didn't hit back. Taiga paused, then calmly replied that his master didn't teach him such a thing, that you don't have to resist. Hoshino's hand trembled as he continued to hold Taiga. She tightened her grip on him and asked if this was so that he could continue to be beaten. The girl clenched her jaw tightly and said that it was too cruel. Both teachers and adults always say the same thing. If you answer, you lose, and the one who turns the other cheek can truly be considered strong. They all said the same thing, but in the end, those who bully will not be tormented by conscience. Nothing will change. The image of Hoshino's desk being painted with various obscenities one day popped up in his head. Just as she was wiping away the scribble, a bucket of water spilled over the girl's head. Hoshino let go of his hand and Taiga said that it couldn't be helped and that he was still too immature and didn't know the exact and correct method. Hoshino asked if that meant they should just be allowed to do whatever they wanted. Taiga said no. He turned his head in the direction of the crowd and continued that according to his master, only someone who knows how to leave a victim in such a state that they were on the verge of death but did not die will be able to truly take revenge. Suddenly, an elderly man called out to the guys who had already moved a good distance away from Taiga and Hoshino. He told them to go back for a few words with Grandpa. It was Master Taiga. Taiga was looking at this scene where the master was standing in front of a crowd of kids. A teacher who defends a student who trusts him completely. Does this really happen? Hoshino's eyes lit up. It was then that she realized that she wanted to become a teacher who would also protect her students. Right now, Hoshino was walking through the city next to Ikuhara. Her gaze was ambiguous. Her brow furrowed, and a bead of sweat rolled down her face. All she could think about was that she had to protect the boys, otherwise she didn't know what would happen to them later. They stopped in front of a large building. Ikuhara said they had arrived. Once inside, it turned out to be a coffee shop. The waitress greeted them with a smile, clutching the tray to her chest. Hoshino wasn't exactly expecting to be brought to the coffee shop. They sat down at a table with Ikuhara across from each other. The man smiled and asked the girl who came to their table for 2 coffees. They sat in silence for a while Ikuhara smiled dirty. He spoke up first and said he'd say it again. Hoshino spoke up and said, looking him straight in the eye, that it was all her fault and that she would take full responsibility and quit the school. Ikuhara smiled nervously, his face looking furious enough. He couldn't believe what she was saying and wondered to himself if she was going to run away from him so easily. Ikuhara tried to pull himself together and smiled nervously, but you could see that he was trembling, clenching his hands into fists. He made sure to cross his arms on the table and told the girl not to rush so much and that he would like to hear her motive first. Ikuhara continued to smile extremely nervously, the veins standing out on his face. It was clear that he was furious, but the man tried to keep his face down and not show it. Hoshino pursed her lips, then lowered her gaze and looked away. She said there had been rumors about this bad party before and it was for investigation. Ikuhara immediately interrupted her and told her that she didn't have to tell any more because it was an obvious lie. The man immediately smiled contentedly, glaring wildly at the girl. Hoshino immediately exclaimed and said that she wasn't lying, and the man retorted and said that it wasn't her who was at the party with Shoko and that it was their janitor, but Takuya, Yusei and Tane were subordinates of the main criminal. And in the end, they all acted on their own. Ikuhara was smiling nastily with his eyes closed. Hoshino immediately exclaimed, not believing what she was hearing. Ikuhara began tapping his fingers on the table and added that he could provide a rebuttal to every statement she made. He grinned and looked down at her, asking her if she was going to continue. The girl clasped her hands in her lap and lowered her head, frowning. Ikuhara's voice interrupted her thoughts and said that if she didn't change her mind, then maybe she only had a chance if they could arrange it in person. Only then can her lies become true in Ikuhara's eyes. Hoshino paled, and after a while, she quietly asked the man what exactly she should do. Ikuhara grinned with all his teeth and started cheering in his head. Well, that's exactly what he wanted, so we can get right to the point. Ikuhara got up from the table, which made Hoshino flinch, and told her that there was a hotel nearby. Ikuhara looked down at her with a crazy smile and added that he was suggesting that she stay there alone until morning. Hoshino's eyes widened, staring in horror at the man in front of her. She pressed her hand to her chest, and the girl began to shake. Suddenly, the phone on her desk vibrated, interrupting her attention. Taiga's name appeared on the phone screen. She looked at the phone carefully and the man said that if she wanted to, she could pick up the phone. However, Hoshino decided to decline the call and said that everything was fine. Taiga was standing outside with his phone in his hands, but the number he dialed didn't answer. He sighed and told himself that he hadn't been able to contact her for a whole day. Taiga decided to dial another number and Yamada answered on the other end of the line. The man immediately asked what was the matter, and Taiga replied that it was very urgent and that he needed to take 100 people with him right away. The man cried out in surprise and asked if there really were 100 of them and if Taiga was going to start a war or something. Taiga replied that he needed to find a person urgently, and that to do this, he would send him a photo of her and hope for Yamada and his people. Yamada looked dejectedly at the phone, making a loud tisk. The people standing in front of Yamada asked what was the matter, and the man replied that Taiga was asking him to gather 100 people. Yamada turned the phone to the boys and showed Hoshino's photo on the screen. The man added that he wanted them to find the girl in the photo and what they thought about it. One of the men said that how could he even ask him, and that they should definitely help their Taiga, and if they don't agree, then what kind of men will they be? Yamada smiled, closing his eyes, and said that they were right about that. Yamada clenched his hand into a fist and told the boys to get everyone together immediately, and a shout of approval went through the entire office. People were looking around at the huge crowd in uniform. A whole squad of men walked through the city center. Taiga was standing outside. It was already dark outside and the sun had long since set. The crowd saw the man and greeted him, and Taiga, who had his back to them, turned to the boys. Yamada smiled and said that he had gathered everyone. The former Yamada clan, and now the Yamada cleaning, a whole 100 in the collection. Yamada was standing in front, and a huge crowd of people was standing behind him. Yamada immediately began giving orders to his crowd. He ordered one group to search the south station further and quickly, and the guys immediately accepted his order. Taiga stood nearby and bowed his head, thinking that Hoshino was still nowhere to be found. Noticing the man's thoughts, Yamada thought that he had never seen a man so tense before. Yamada's phone suddenly rang, and the man immediately snatched the phone out of his pocket and answered the call. He asked if they'd found her, and the voice on the phone said they'd found her at the hotel. Yamada looked back at Taiga questioningly, but the man didn't say anything. In the next second, he curtly told them to hurry. After a while, they arrived at a 3-story building with a hotel sign shining brightly from above. Ikuhara sat on the bed while Hoshino stood next to him. He leaned on his hands and asked her how she felt and that the hotel was just gorgeous and his favorite. Hoshino cringed and looked away, her expression extremely grim. Ikuhara arched an eyebrow and thought that there was no reaction from the girl, even though he had chosen the most luxurious room. Ikuhara patted the bed next to him and asked with a smile if the girl would like to sit down first, but Hoshino exhaled and said that it would probably be fine. Ikuhara immediately sighed loudly, his face darkening a little. In the next second, with a serious face, he looked at the girl and asked if she still didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. His eyes were blank as Hoshino was horrified by the reaction. The girl pressed her hands to her chest. She lowered her sad gaze to the floor and thought that if she endured everything, she would definitely save the students. The girl squeezed her eyes shut. Without waiting for her reaction, Ikuhara got up from the couch and said that he would have to do everything himself. He walked up to the girl, reaching out to touch her face, and she looked at the man in horror. Just as he was grabbing her chin, the door to the suite suddenly swung open. Yamada's men rushed into the room and excused themselves with a happy smile and introduced themselves as cleaning Yamada. Ikuhara spun around, not understanding what was going on here, and neither did Hoshino, who clearly hadn't expected this development. A huge crowd of men entered the room saying that they were here to clean up their room. People immediately lined up in 2 straight lines as Taiga walked inside, adjusting his cap and talking about how he finally found the girl. Hoshino immediately blushed, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She didn't expect Banjo to come for her. Ikuhara looked furious and started gnashing his teeth. He pointed a finger in Taiga's direction and asked who he was and that he would call the police on him. Taiga didn't say anything and then glared at the man in such a way that Ikuhara jumped on the spot. A second later, he was right next to his face and with a murderous look, he told him not to stop him from talking because he wasn't finished yet. Ikuhara immediately went quiet and pale, not understanding what was going on. Taiga turned to Ami and placed a hand on his chest, loudly telling her that he was wrong. The girl, however, did not immediately understand what was going on and looked at him questioningly. He came closer to the girl and added that protecting students is the duty of the class teacher, which for some reason he forgot. I made my decision without consulting her and I acted recklessly. Ami blushed slightly as she looked at the man in front of her. The girl hesitated, but the guy continued and said that it was all because he did not try to understand what exactly she was feeling. Ami hadn't expected such words. Taiga told her that he understood why she was angry and that was why he was asking for her forgiveness. The guy immediately fell to his knees and hit his head on the floor, asking the girl for forgiveness. Both Ikuhara and Ami didn't expect this, and the nearby Yamada boys immediately shed tears, trying to hold back their tears. Yamada silently smiled and exhaled as he watched them. Hoshino immediately fussed and told the guy to look up and that she wasn't angry at all. Taiga immediately stood up and asked if she was sure about that. The girl frowned and replied that she was the one who originally told him all sorts of nonsense. Ami bowed down and apologized. Taiga immediately jumped up and asked if this meant that the girl didn't want to stop communicating, and the girl immediately roused up and replied that of course not. Taiga immediately smiled in relief, and the next second, he turned around and was about to head for the exit, apologizing for the fact that they suddenly got in, which caused the girl to look blankly after the man's back. Taiga was smiling, and the guys next to him supported him and said that he was a great guy, and that they were insanely happy for him. Ikuhara grinned. All he thought to himself was that these guys were a bunch of fools, and he was already afraid that they had come to help her in the first place. Suddenly, they stopped in the aisle when Taiga got a call and picked up the phone, standing up straight. Ikuhara watched them carefully. Taiga answered the phone and heard the voice of a restless Shoko, who said that Takuya had been run over by older guys, and he beat them all up, of course, but that wasn't so important, and that these guys said they were going to be expelled. Taiga asked her what she was talking about. Shoko explained that the guy sold the information to Ikuhara's teacher, and he wanted to use this information to take advantage of their teacher. Taiga paused for a few seconds, then glanced over his shoulder darkly and asked if this was accurate information. Ikuhara immediately trembled, not understanding what was being said, and asked what Taiga needed more. Shoko went on to say that the information was completely accurate, and that Yuki had told her that the two of them had been seen together at a coffee shop today. Yuki works part-time as a waitress, but she takes off her glasses while working, and it was almost as if that was why they hadn't recognized her at the time. Taiga's gaze immediately became frenzied, and his eyes shone brightly. Ikuhara immediately fell to the floor in fear. Yamada looked at Ikuhara from under his brows and told the boys that it was time to get out. Ikuhara immediately swallowed nervously, sweat starting to roll down his face. He wondered if it was the cleaning company he was looking at, because no matter how you looked at them, they looked like bandits. Ikuhara wanted to run away, jumping up abruptly and running towards the exit with a pale and terrified face, but at the same time, a mop landed on his face and said that there was a very large spot running around. Another started vacuuming it and saying that it was necessary to vacuum it for cleanliness, and then even on top with a brush. Ikuhara started yelling about how much he was in pain, and Yamada joined in, telling him to work as hard as possible. Ami and Taiga stood to the side, watching the entire process. After a while, Ikuhara ran out in his underwear, without any clothes on, covered in cuts and bruises. The poor guy was crying and drooling and snotting and thinking to himself that they were definitely some crazy lunatics, but he remembered all their faces. Ikuhara kept running down the corridor as fast as he could, trying to get as far away as possible. He was thinking that he would definitely dig up some dirty information and destroy their lives. Ikuhara ran to the exit and threw open the door, saying that he was almost out and there should be a security exit here. Taiga was already waiting for him on the stairs with his arms crossed. Ikuhara pointed a finger at him in horror and shouted out who he was. Taiga adjusted the cap on his head and replied that he was Taiga Banjo's janitor, not happy to meet you. Ikuhara gritted his teeth and replied that now it was clear why his face was so familiar to him, since Taiga worked as a janitor at their school. Ikuhara was sweating profusely, but he kept shouting at him and telling him not to think that he could get away with this so easily, and that the man would definitely get him fired from this school as a result. Taiga's reaction was indifferent, and he replied that he didn't really care. He began to walk slowly up the stairs to meet Ikuhara. The man said that he had no idea who Ikuhara was or if he had any power. Ikuhara started to back away, meeting Taiga's frantic eyes. Taiga grabbed his waist and lunged at him, causing the man to fall backwards. Ikuhara lost his balance when Taiga easily hoisted him over his shoulder and told him that he was just doing his job. Ikuhara glared at the boy, trying to loosen his grip, but Taiga continued to hold him casually. Ikuhara asked him what he really meant by that. Taiga walked to the edge of the partition and looked down. At the bottom of another building, 2 dumpsters were stacked against the wall. Suddenly, Taiga jumped down from Ikuhara in his arms, while the man tried to stop him and screamed in horror, reaching out with his hands to the surface that had gone out from under his feet. Taiga said with a vicious look that trash should always be in the trash can, and yanked Ikuhara forward straight into the dumpster. With a huge noise, Ikuhara landed on the trash, and a banana peel landed on top of him, decorating his back. Ikuhara was completely unconscious. Taiga jumped down calmly to the ground, adjusting the cap on his head, and summed up that the garbage collection was finally over. Ami ran out to meet Taiga and threw herself into his arms. Taiga said that the girl would get so dirty, and Ami tearfully said that it wasn't a big deal. She wrapped her arms tightly around his waist and thanked him. Ami immediately recoiled and asked if he himself was fine. After all, he fell from such a height, and Taiga replied that everything was fine and clarified how the girl herself felt. The man was still unconscious and asked if Ikuhara had done anything to her yet. The girl said no thanks to them, and the guy asked why she even met Ikuhara alone. Taiga asked for more details and Ami took a deep breath. She told him everything that had happened, from beginning to end, and that was why she had tried to deceive him, that she had been there. But it hadn't worked. Ami explained that she was just desperate to save the students and apologized while bowing down to Taiga. The man told her not to apologize and asked how Ikuhara even knew about the Midorikikai incident. Ami said that all the teachers knew about what happened, and Taiga added that only he knew that he was the one who changed into a woman. Taiga wondered who might have leaked the information about him, and Ami replied that only those who were there could have known. Taiga nodded and said that it only meant that Ikuhara had connections with dangerous people. Ami thought about it, and the man added that it could be even more dangerous than he initially thought, but she didn't have to fight the enemy alone, and she could always call him. Ami panicked and said that they were bandits, and the guy told her to leave such things to experts like him. He hadn't taught her much yet, so it would take time for her to be able to defend herself. Ami's eyes flashed. She remembered that little Taiga, a teacher who defends his student, and a student who fully trusts him. Ami looked at him and knew that yes, she definitely wanted to be as strong as he was. Ami blushed slightly, then looked at the boy and smiled, telling him that she was relying on him to do so. Taiga nodded and said that he was fine with that. Ikuhara suddenly rose from the garbage, shouting at them to stop cooing and who they thought they were doing what they wanted. Ikuhara pointed a finger at them and added that he would trample them both into the ground, and Taiga replied that he should only deal with him and not involve Ami in this. Ikuhara yelled out angrily about why he was the only one in his underpants who had been attacked by a crowd of cleaning staff. The man started shouting insults and threats at Ami, saying that he would ruin both of their lives and that she shouldn't make such an innocent face, and if she just did what she wanted, then everything would be fine. But suddenly his fiery monologue was interrupted by Yamada, who put his hand on his shoulder. Your hand. He chuckled and said that he adored such energetic people and would be happy if they played together, which made Ikuhara jump back and ask who he was and why he wouldn't go anywhere. Yamada looked at him questioningly and asked if he would like to take a walk to their office nearby.